For more than a generation, discussion about the origins and meaning of Druidism virtually disappeared from serious historical debate in Britain. While scholars in France and Germany continued to explore the subject with energy, British historians gradually abandoned it. By the later decades of the 19th century, Druidism had become a topic most professionals preferred to avoid. It was widely viewed as a dangerous distraction from proper historical inquiry, a subject that seemed to attract speculation rather than evidence. Only a handful of writers still pursued it, and many of them were dismissed as eccentric or unreliable. There was, however, one notable exception. In the early 20th century, a careful and balanced study titled The Druids was produced by T.D. Kendrick of the British Museum. Unlike earlier works, it treated the subject with restraint and fairness, gathering all reliable material then available and presenting it without exaggeration. For a long time, Kendrick's work stood alone as the only serious examination of Druidism acceptable within academic circles. The reluctance of historians was not entirely without cause. Over the preceding century, Druidism had been burdened with increasingly extravagant theories. Early modern writers had revived interest in the Druids after classical references to them faded in late antiquity. But by the Victorian era, this interest had become distorted. Druids were portrayed as keepers of secret wisdom surpassing all known civilizations, masters of astronomy, engineering, and supernatural forces. Some claimed they were linked to Indian Brahmins, others to Greek philosophers, Buddhist monks, or Persian priests. According to these accounts, nothing in nature or the cosmos lay beyond their understanding, and their religion was said to surpass all others in moral and spiritual depth. Faced with such theatrical portrayals, many modern thinkers reacted sharply in the opposite direction. Late 19th century critics dismissed the Druids as little more than tribal shamans, healers, and ritual performers, presiding over a crude and primitive belief system. In their eagerness to correct exaggeration, they often replaced fantasy with scorn. Their rejection of the subject was no less extreme than the claims they were trying to refute, and the topic itself was left stranded between ridicule and myth. When examined calmly and without prejudice, Druidic belief reveals itself as something far more complex than either its admirers or detractors once allowed. Seen through the lens of comparative religion and folklore, it emerges as a coherent system rooted in very ancient human experiences. Over the past century, new approaches to religious history and archaeology have transformed the understanding of early belief systems, and these developments shed fresh light on Druidism. Particularly important is the growing body of research into sacred kingship, the idea that a ruler embodies the life force of the land itself. Studies by scholars of myth and tradition have shown that, in many early societies, the health of crops, animals, and people was believed to depend directly on the vitality of the king. When this framework is applied to Druidic practice, long ignored evidence begins to make sense. Discoveries relating to early food-gathering societies and the reverence shown to trees as providers of sustenance also expand understanding of how Druidic belief took shape. Long before agriculture became dominant, certain trees were treated with deep respect because they provided essential nourishment. Across much of prehistoric Europe, forests of oak trees covered the land. These trees supplied timber for shelter and fuel, and their acorns were ground into flour and baked as food. For early communities, the oak was not simply a plant, but a vital source of survival. It is hardly surprising that such a tree came to be viewed as sacred. Over time, the oak was no longer revered merely for what it provided, but was associated with divine power. It came to be linked with the sky, storms, and the forces that governed growth and fertility. Evidence shows that this form of tree worship once existed across Europe, from the eastern mountains to the Atlantic coast. Among Greeks and Romans, the oak retained religious significance but gradually faded into the background. Among Celtic societies, however, it remained central for far longer. Celtic religion eventually developed a rich pantheon of deities, comparable to those of the classical world. Yet alongside these gods, reverence for the oak endured. It was within this context that what later became known as Druidism took shape. The Druids appear to have functioned not only as ritual specialists, but as custodians of a belief system tied to kingship, land, and the cycles of nature. The connection between Druidism and sacred kingship is especially striking. In many early traditions, the ruler was believed to carry within himself the power that sustained the world around him. His well-being ensured fertility and order. His failure threatened chaos. While the exact relationship between Druid priests and kings remains uncertain, the evidence suggests they were once closely linked, perhaps even united in origin. Priesthood and kingship may have emerged from the same sacred role before diverging into separate functions. The meaning of the word, commonly rendered in English as Druid, has long been debated. Some scholars have argued that it originally referred to wisdom or knowledge. Others have pointed to linguistic connections with words meaning oak or tree across several ancient languages. These interpretations suggest that the term may once have described those who served or interpreted the sacred tree, rather than abstract philosophers or scholars. Support for this view appears in both language and custom. In several European cultures, groups associated with oak forests held special ritual privileges. Across myth and tradition, the oak frequently appears as a symbol of divine authority and cosmic order. Even long after formal Druidism faded, the sacred character of groves and trees persisted in Celtic regions, preserved in folklore and place names. Some later scholars rejected the oak connection, arguing instead that the term referred simply to learned individuals. Yet this explanation struggles to account for the overwhelming symbolic importance of trees in early belief systems. When the broader context of ancient religion is considered, the association between Druids and the oak fits naturally into a widespread pattern of human reverence for life-giving plants. There is even reason to suspect that early myths once described humanity itself as descending from trees. Stories from Northern Europe speak of the first humans being shaped from wood, while similar traditions appear in other parts of the world. In societies dependent on forests for survival, such beliefs would have expressed a deep sense of kinship between people and the natural world. Some modern scholars have questioned whether the very word used to describe the Druids has any genuine ancient roots at all. It has been argued that no early form of the term survives in Welsh, and that related words in Welsh and Breton may have been created relatively late. From this perspective, these terms are seen not as remnants of an ancient religious vocabulary, but as later inventions shaped by medieval or early modern imagination. Others have gone further, stating that no linguistic connection can be demonstrated between the word traditionally rendered as Druid and the Celtic terms for oak. According to this view, attempts to link the priesthood to tree worship rest on assumption rather than firm linguistic evidence. The oak, it is claimed, played no role in shaping the original meaning of the word. An alternative explanation once gained attention through the suggestion that the name of the Druids was connected not with a tree, but with a bird. According to this interpretation, the term was linked to a Celtic word meaning wren, a bird associated in folklore with prophecy and divination. In this view, the Druids were understood as truth-tellers, intermediaries who revealed divine knowledge through signs and omens, much as augurs did in other ancient cultures. Yet this explanation raises its own difficulties. It seems unlikely that an entire priesthood would be named after a small divinatory bird rather than after the sacred object at the heart of its worship. The oak, after all, was not merely symbolic but central to ritual, belief, and cosmology. Unless the bird itself was understood as the living spirit of the oak, the logic appears strained. That possibility cannot be entirely dismissed, since, in several ancient traditions, birds associated with trees were believed to embody divine forces, especially those linked to storms and lightning. In some European regions, killing a wren was thought to invite disaster from the sky, suggesting a lingering connection between the bird and celestial power. Even so, it seems far more plausible that the bird acquired its name from its association with the sacred tree, rather than that an ancient religious institution took its name from the bird. The direction of influence, in this case, almost certainly runs from tree to symbol, not the other way around. At the same time, there is no attempt here to compel acceptance of a single explanation, simply because it aligns neatly with a broader interpretation of Druidism. The claim that the word originally meant something like man of the oak or servant of the oak has long been treated with suspicion, partly because of an early classical writer's unfortunate attempt to explain it through Greek rather than Celtic language. That explanation, though well-intentioned, created lasting confusion and encouraged later scholars to distrust any connection between the Druids and oak worship altogether. This reaction, however, may say as much about scholarly temperament as it does about evidence. Linguistic debate has often been shaped by a reluctance to appear naive or uncritical, and in some cases by a desire to distance serious scholarship from anything that appears too simple or symbolic. The idea that a major religious institution could be named after a tree has struck some scholars as implausible, not because it contradicts known patterns of ancient religion, but because it challenges modern assumptions about how belief systems are labelled and remembered. It has been suggested that skepticism toward the oak-based interpretation arises less from linguistic necessity than from intellectual caution, or even from the ambition to offer a more sophisticated alternative. Throughout history, scholars have often preferred complex explanations over straightforward ones, particularly when a simpler theory has already gained wide acceptance. As for the later association of the Druids with magic, healing, or popular superstition, this too follows a familiar historical pattern. Many words that once carried neutral or respected meanings have gradually acquired negative or diminished connotations. Titles that originally described social roles or professions have, over time, come to imply deception, ignorance, or moral inferiority. Language does not stand still, and meaning is shaped as much by cultural change as by origin. It is entirely possible that even in antiquity, the original meaning of the term had already begun to blur. Popular interpretation often reshapes language long before scholars attempt to define it. By the time classical writers encountered the Druids, the word may already have carried multiple meanings, understood differently by priests, rulers, and ordinary people alike. Modern linguistic analysis, for all its precision, has not always clarified historical inquiry. On the contrary, it has sometimes complicated it by isolating words from the cultural systems that gave them life. When belief, ritual, language, and environment are separated too sharply, interpretation becomes narrower rather than more accurate. For these reasons, the conclusion adopted here is that the original meaning of the word, commonly translated as Druid, referred to a priesthood centered on the cult of the oak. The cumulative weight of historical, religious, and folkloric evidence points consistently in that direction. Later chapters will demonstrate that alternative interpretations struggle to account for the full range of material available. It is also necessary to address the broader historical presence of the Druids, particularly in light of modern skepticism. Ancient writers across the Mediterranean world were clearly aware of them. Even if they misunderstood Druidic doctrine, they recognized the Druids as figures of authority and learning. References appear across centuries, in poetry, philosophy, and religious polemic. Their reputation extended far beyond the regions in which they lived. This makes it curious that some modern commentators dismiss Druidism as historically insignificant or even imaginary. In many cases, such dismissal reflects not deep familiarity with the sources, but a narrow focus on material evidence alone. Excavation can reveal much, but belief systems are not always preserved in stone or soil. Literary testimony remains essential, especially for understanding religious life. When the surviving material is examined objectively, it becomes clear that evidence for the existence of the Druids is at least as substantial as that for many other early historical phenomena. In some cases, it is stronger. Figures associated with Druidic tradition are better attested than other legendary or semi-legendary individuals whose stories are widely accepted. Classical authors wrote of the Druids with fascination and, at times, admiration. Their fame reached distant lands long before the rise of Christianity in Northern Europe. Over several centuries, numerous writers referred to them, indicating that Druidism was not a marginal curiosity, but a recognized and influential tradition. To deny historical status to such a phenomenon is not caution, but imbalance. The evidence may be incomplete, but it is neither trivial nor negligible. Druidism occupies a real place in the religious and intellectual landscape of ancient Europe, and any attempt to understand that world must take it seriously. Every solid ancient reference to the Druidic tradition places it inside Celtic-speaking societies. That fact is clear enough. Yet it does not automatically follow that the system itself was invented by the Celts, or that its deepest ideas were uniquely Celtic. Traditions with closely comparable features appear among Germanic and Slavic peoples as well, in some regions surviving into relatively late times. The more likely picture is older and broader, a ritual pattern that emerged early in European cultural history, then attached itself to different populations as they moved, mixed, and settled across the continent. The aim here is not to argue theology or reconstruct doctrine, but to describe as plainly as possible what can be said about where Druidism shows up and how it is reported in the areas where it operated. When written, European history begins to offer clearer outlines. This form of religion is most visible in parts of Gaul, roughly modern France. One of the earliest mentions comes second-hand rather than as a direct description. A writer in the early 3rd century of the Common Era reports that the Druids had already been discussed in earlier works, including one attributed to a famous philosopher but later recognized as unreliable, and another by a Greek author writing a couple of centuries before the rise of Christianity. The point is not that these lost books can be trusted in detail, but that the name and the idea were already circulating in educated Greek circles, long before Roman authors wrote their best-known accounts. By around the end of the 3rd century before the Common Era, Druidism appears to have been established in Gaul. At that time, the region was not a single unified nation, but a patchwork of peoples. One group occupied the southwest, between the mountains and the great river systems. Another dominated a broad central zone reaching from the southeast into the northwestern territories. A third held much of the north beyond the major river lines. The question that immediately follows is whether all these populations shared the same religious institutions. The record is uneven. If the southwestern communities practiced Druidism, history offers almost no description of it. For the northern groups, the situation is disputed. Some reconstructions suggest that Druidism entered Gaul from Britain through migrants who later crossed the Channel, while other interpretations argue that the first clear references tell nothing at all about the true birthplace of the tradition. Some modern readings even entertain the possibility that Druidism existed both in the southwest and in the north. But this runs up against a stubborn problem. In those regions, neither written testimony nor durable tradition provides a clear foothold. For many historians, that absence is persuasive. It suggests that Druidism, at least in the form that ancient writers described, did not maintain a stable presence everywhere in Gaul, even if related practices may have existed. The richest description of Gallic Druidism comes from Julius Caesar. His account is the closest thing to a full field report that survives from antiquity, and it deserves attention because it covers social power as much as ritual. In his depiction, two groups stood out sharply in Gaul: the noble class and the Druids. The Druids handled sacred matters, conducted ceremonies both public and private, and served as interpreters of religious law. Large numbers of young men sought them out for education, and their authority was widely recognized. They also functioned as judges. They settled private disputes and public controversies, ruled on serious crimes, and decided cases involving inheritance and land boundaries. Those who refused their judgments could be barred from participation in religious life, and such exclusion carried real social punishment. A leading figure presided over the Druids, with succession determined by prestige or, when contested, by selection that could even spill into violence. Caesar also describes annual gatherings at a central sacred location in the territory of a specific tribe, treated as a kind of religious and legal hub. People with disputes travelled there to submit their cases. He reports a tradition that this religious system was believed to have begun in Britain and later spread to Gaul, and adds that those seeking deeper training sometimes travelled across the sea to study it more thoroughly. The Druids enjoyed exemptions that mattered in a warrior society. They were not compelled to serve in the army and were not taxed in the usual way. These privileges encouraged recruits. Training, according to Caesar, relied heavily on memorized verse, and some students spent many years mastering it. The knowledge was kept oral rather than written, even though letters were used for other transactions. Caesar interprets this as a deliberate effort to preserve secrecy and strengthen memory. He also reports a key belief: the soul continues after death and passes into another body. He claims this idea fueled courage by reducing fear of dying. Beyond that, Druidic teaching included observations about the sky and the movement of celestial bodies, ideas about the structure of the world, and explanations of divine power. Whether every point is perfectly understood is another matter, but the overall picture is of an educated religious class with real influence over law, learning, and public life. Caesar's narrative includes a darker element as well: the accusation of human sacrifice. He describes a belief that life could be paid for life, especially during disease or war, and he portrays large ritual constructions filled with victims. According to him, criminals were preferred, but if none were available, others could be used. He also claims that the Gauls traced their ancestry to an underworld god, and that they worshipped a set of deities that he compares to familiar Roman gods. Whatever modern judgment is made about these claims, Caesar's report matters for two reasons. First, it offers a coherent snapshot of a religious institution functioning inside a tribal political world. Second, many of the features he lists resemble patterns found in other societies at similar stages of development. The reliance on memorized instruction, the role of priests as legal authorities, beliefs about the soul, nature-based learning, and even ritual violence are not unique to Gaul. What is striking is how closely parts of his description echo later traditions recorded in Ireland, which suggests that at least the broad outline he gives is grounded in real observation. Other classical writers also refer to Druids in Gaul. Some may have borrowed heavily from earlier descriptions, but it is unlikely that every detail from every author is mere copying. Later accounts add elements that Caesar does not emphasize, especially around divination and ritual technique. Taken together, these sources do not replace Caesar, but they help fill out the edges of the picture. The Druids appear to have exercised influence over governance as well. Caesar's depiction implies that major disputes between groups could be brought before them at the central assembly site. Some historians have argued that this administrative authority makes sense if the Druids were not isolated local priests, but part of a wider network, a permanent federation with hierarchy and regular meetings. In such a structure, religious unity could reinforce political coordination, especially in a region divided into many competing communities. That same structure, however, was poorly suited to survive the full force of Roman conquest. As Rome expanded, the Druids became both a symbol of local identity and a potential engine of resistance. For the conquerors, an organized native elite with legal power, religious authority, and educational influence represented a serious obstacle. Once Rome moved from raids and alliances into direct control, Druidism could be seen as something that needed to be weakened. After Caesar entered Gaul, rebellion broke out under a young leader who managed to unite a large coalition. The struggle lasted for a full campaigning season and was fought as a test of survival for both sides. When the rebellion collapsed, the position of the Druids fractured. Some aligned with Roman authority, others with local leaders. The defeat did not simply break armies, it disrupted institutions. One interpretation of the deeper rupture focuses on kingship. The rebellion's leader was treated by supporters as a king in practice, even if the political climate in Gaul had grown hostile to monarchy. His own father, a powerful figure, had allegedly been executed for attempting to restore royal rule. Yet the older idea of sacred kingship may still have carried force beneath the surface. If Druidic authority was tied closely to that concept, then the fall of a would-be king could also damage the religious structure that supported him. Under this reading, the collapse of monarchy and the weakening of Druidism are not separate events, but linked failures inside the same system. Roman suppression did not arrive in a single strike. It unfolded in stages. At first, participation in Druidic rites was restricted for Roman citizens. Later, the Roman state moved more directly against practices it considered unacceptable, particularly those associated with ritual killing. Under a later emperor, measures became harsher. Even then, complete eradication was difficult. Rome also pursued a different strategy, replacing Druidic legal functions with Romanized offices and reshaping local religion by installing alternative priestly roles aligned with imperial administration. As official power collapsed, what remained of Druidism appears to have drifted toward the margins. Ancient poetry already imagines Druids retreating into sacred groves. In later decades, scattered prophetic figures in Gaul were blamed for predicting Rome's destruction and for stirring hopes of Gallic dominance returning. Whether these individuals were true heirs of the old priesthood or opportunists borrowing a feared name, the pattern suggests a tradition sliding from public institution into shadowed reputation. Even so, hints of continuity appear centuries later. Late Roman writers describe individuals in Gaul who claimed ancestry linked to older sacred lines. and some church-era remarks suggest that memories of Druids survived in popular imagination long after their official structures faded. Meanwhile, Christian councils in Gaul repeatedly condemned the worship of trees, stones, and springs. Those bans imply that older nature-based rites still had enough traction to worry bishops and lawmakers, even when the old priesthood was gone. The question of Druidism in southern Britain is even more disputed. For a long time, antiquarian tradition treated Britain not merely as a stronghold of Druidism, but as its birthplace. More recent scholarship has often reacted against that certainty. Some conservative modern writers have even argued that Druidism never truly existed in southern Britain at all, at least not as an organised institution comparable to what is described in Gaul. The evidence in classical literature is thin. Caesar reports a belief that Druidism began in Britain and that students went there for deeper training. That claim carries weight because Caesar had close contact with Gallic elites and likely received information from informed local sources. Trade and travel between Gaul and Britain were constant, and a learned Gallic informant would have had real knowledge of what existed across the Channel. At the same time, Caesar does not state the claim as a proven fact. He presents it as something commonly believed. A century later, a Roman historian describes a military campaign against an island sanctuary, portraying a dramatic defense involving chanting women, flaming torches, and priests calling down curses. The Roman soldiers, shocked at first, press forward, defeat the defenders, and destroy the sacred groves. This is often treated as the strongest narrative describing Druids on British soil, yet even here the scene is tied to a particular place and moment, not to widespread organisation across the entire region. Another Roman writer discussing magic and ritual suggests that Britain maintained elaborate ceremonies that impressed outsiders, and implies that Roman rule brought an end to what he saw as a dangerous cult. His wording is brief, but it has been taken to suggest that although institutional Druidism may have been suppressed, related practices and beliefs lingered. These three references are essentially the whole classical foundation for British Druidism. That is why debate persists. Some argue that such slender testimony cannot support confident claims about a powerful British priesthood. Others counter that the references, though few, are too specific to dismiss completely, especially when connected to what is known from Ireland and from continental practice. Attempts to resolve the question have often been unsatisfying. Some writers deny Druidism in southern Britain outright, yet later concede possibilities when confronted with awkward details. Others accept it too readily, then attach it to monuments or landscapes without evidence, treating stone circles as automatic proof of Druids. That approach has done lasting damage by blending archaeology with assumption. More cautious scholars have argued that, in England specifically, there is no clear ancient reference to Druids at all, and that any organised priesthood comparable to Gaul would have had little importance after the Roman conquest. From this standpoint, if a Druidic tradition existed in southern Britain, it may have depended mainly on kings and local elites, rather than on a strong, independent religious hierarchy. It may have been preserved through respected elders, rather than through a large, formal order. Even then, this remains a model, not a proven conclusion. There is also disagreement about whether Druidism was brought by Celtic newcomers, or inherited from older populations already living in the region. Some theories suggest it began among pre-Celtic communities, and later reached agreements with Celtic conquerors, allowing the cult to survive by adapting. Other versions shift the origin among different Celtic branches, proposing transfers between Ireland, Britain, and Gaul in different directions. The problem is that firm proof of a single racial origin is lacking. The pattern may be older than such categories, tied less to one people than to the forested zones of Europe, where early tree-centered ritual could flourish. Some historians once argued that migrations from Britain carried Druidism back into Gaul. Others believed the opposite, that continental Celts introduced it into Britain. Another line of argument tried to use later Irish texts that mention a Druid of the Britons as support for Druidism in southern Britain, before Rome. Yet even that phrase does not settle the geography. It could refer to tribes farther north rather than to England and Wales, and it cannot be treated as decisive evidence for a southern British priesthood. Some historians have argued that wherever Roman authority took hold in Britain, Druidism weakened quickly and lost the ability to function as an effective institution. One careful scholar points to a telling silence in the Roman sources. A major biography describing years of administration in Britain never even mentions Druids. That absence is often treated as meaningful, not as proof on its own, but as a sign that in Roman-controlled districts, any organised Druidic presence may have faded early. This silence becomes even more striking when examining accounts of the Great Uprising led by the Iceni. Roman narratives of that rebellion describe warfare, leadership, and ritual drama, yet they do not clearly place Druids among the rebels. That omission feels unexpected, especially if parts of the Iceni elite had continental ties. Some reconstructions suggest that their upper class may have had strong connections to Gaul, which would normally imply familiarity with Druidic tradition. The revolt's leader is described performing acts of divination, yet not as a formal priest. Later, writers sometimes blur that distinction, but the ancient descriptions suggest a war leader using prophecy and ritual as political theatre, rather than presiding over a structured priesthood. One later account, written in Greek, paints an especially grim scene. It claims that after the sack of a major settlement, captive women were subjected to violent ritual killing in a grove dedicated to a goddess named Andraste. The description includes methods that resemble practices attributed to Druidic sacrifice. Yet the report creates its own doubts. The goddess named in the episode appears to be linked, in continental contexts, with a group in southeastern Gaul, which makes her appearance in Britain hard to explain. That mismatch has led many to treat the passage with caution. It contains details that seem to support a Druidic pattern, while also introducing elements that feel misplaced. The result is not a clean confirmation, but a problematic piece of testimony that can be read in more than one way. Turning from classical history to folk memory does not resolve the uncertainty. In the traditions recorded from Britain itself, surprisingly little can be identified as a reliable survival of Druidic practice. Any claim based on memory alone needs careful scrutiny, because legends are easily reshaped by later storytelling. Still, one notable belief appears in early Irish tradition: the idea that the highest mastery of magical knowledge was learned in Britain. Irish tales repeatedly describe heroes and seers achieving their peak training only after spending time across the sea in Alba. Whether this reflects an actual historical school of practice or a literary convention, it suggests that Britain retained a reputation as a source of powerful ritual knowledge. Another consideration strengthens the possibility that Druidism once existed more widely in Britain than later evidence suggests. In Scotland and Ireland, Druidic traditions appear to have persisted for centuries after the Roman withdrawal. Those traditions were not purely about charms or crude superstition. They are portrayed, at least in some sources, as having ethical ideas, a structured worldview, and a kind of learned character that imitates science and philosophy. If such a tradition survives so long on the northern and western edges of the British world, it becomes harder to imagine that the southern regions had been completely untouched earlier on. There are also curious survivals in rural custom that some have tried to connect to older ritual systems. For a long time, small herds of white cattle were preserved in parts of England and Scotland, and in a few cases were maintained with remarkable care. The persistence of these herds has been recorded more than once, and the focus on white animals is especially striking, since that colour is repeatedly linked in ancient descriptions with sacrificial practice. The survival of these animals as a segregated and protected group, while other colour varieties were allowed to decline, has led some to suspect that they represent the last fragments of herds once set aside for religious use. In some places, stories about misfortune or fate connected to the families who owned these cattle also survived, hinting at older meanings that later generations no longer fully understood. Place names are sometimes brought forward as evidence, but they are often less decisive than they appear. One notable example lies outside England itself, on the Isle of Man. There, a stone bearing an early inscription has been read as identifying a man as the son of a Druid. If that reading is correct, it would imply that Druid figures, at least in an Irish sense of the term, existed in the island world well into the first centuries after Rome. The Isle of Man, in fact, preserves a number of traditions that connect it to Druids, and its location between Ireland, Scotland, and Britain makes it a plausible crossroads for such memories. In England proper, a few sites have names that seem to gesture toward Druids, but these cases often dissolve under closer examination. A village name may be late, or trace back to a family surname rather than a religious tradition. Stone circles and standing stones are frequently labelled Druidic in popular imagination, but this is not the same as evidence. Across the countryside, stories attach Druids to famous monuments and strange stones. Great prehistoric complexes, circles on moors, isolated boulders given dramatic names, or local formations explained through folklore. The problem is that the same pattern repeats everywhere. Druids become a convenient label for anything ancient, mysterious, and pre-Christian. That does not demonstrate that Druids built the monuments or even used them. It shows how later generations tried to give meaning to ruins whose true origins were forgotten. This leads into a larger theme, the power of romantic imagination. A careful reconstruction of how Druid legends spread in Britain shows that much of what people now assume was not inherited from antiquity, but rediscovered and reinvented much later. After the Saxon period, knowledge of Druids in England appears to have faded drastically, then returned slowly in the 16th century as scholars began reading classical historians again. The idea that Druids built megalithic monuments did not arise from ancient memory. It took shape in the late 17th century and spread widely in the centuries that followed, especially as poets and writers embraced Druids as symbols of mystery, nature, and lost wisdom. This is a known hazard in the study of folklore. Popular belief is not sealed off from literature. Stories travel, texts reshape memory, and invented legends can attach themselves to real places until they feel ancient. Tales collected in one region often show traces of imported story worlds, and many local traditions turn out to be recent creations inspired by poems, novels, or travel accounts. A legend with no deep roots can still become powerful simply because it is repeated often enough. Given this, the evidence for Druids in England remains thin. Apart from Caesar's claim, there is essentially no firm historical testimony placing Druids inside England itself. Folk tradition offers little that can be treated as reliable memory. One medieval Latin narrative mentions a British ruler consulting magicians or wise men, and a later Irish version uses the word Druids to translate that term. That has tempted some readers to treat the passage as proof. Yet the same story quickly moves into openly mythical material involving symbolic dragons and the appearance of a famous prophet figure. without parallel evidence, it is difficult to treat that episode as a trustworthy report of surviving Druid institutions. The most cautious conclusion is also the simplest. If Druidism did exist in what is now England, it may have been eliminated rapidly after the Roman invasion and administration began, leaving almost no visible traces. In Gaul, the weakening of native kingship may have helped trigger the collapse of Druid authority, especially if the priesthood was closely tied to sacred rulership. In Scotland and Ireland, where forms of kingship endured longer, Druidic tradition may have found stronger ground for survival. Wales presents a different picture. A Druid presence in Anglesey is supported by ancient narrative, and that alone anchors the possibility of Druidism in part of the Welsh region. Yet when turning to early Welsh literature, clear references to Druids are surprisingly rare compared with the rich Irish material. Some scholars suggest that Welsh tradition preserved a native counterpart to the divine figures associated with Druidic religion, but direct mentions of Druids often appear late, and sometimes the term is applied in Christian contexts, to foreign, wise men rather than to a native priesthood. In medieval Wales, the word Druid begins to appear more often in poems connected to the bardic world. Poets speak of Druids as messengers, judges of excellence, interpreters of prophecy, and members of an elite circle. They describe splendour, chains of gold, authority, and mystical knowledge as if such figures still existed. Yet the historical setting is already Christian. That suggests not the survival of an ancient priesthood in its old form, but a transformation. The title and aura associated with Druids may have been absorbed into the bardic class, creating a kind of poetic and symbolic Druidism, rather than a direct continuation of pagan religious power. This raises another complication: translation and interpretation. Leading critics have warned that some early Welsh poetry has been rendered so uncertainly that building strong theories on it is risky. Even so, uncertain translation does not automatically mean the poems are inauthentic. It does mean that claims about Druids must be made cautiously. Alongside direct mentions, Welsh poems contain repeated imagery that seems tied to oak worship and sacred groves. Some lines speak of woodland circles and feathered oaks, language that evokes ritual landscapes. Another famous poem about battling trees contains verses that later readers interpreted as linking identity and sacred status to the oak itself. Some older commentators argued that the Welsh word for druid was built directly from the word for oak, and even identified a special title implying mastery or adeptship connected to the tree. Whatever the final verdict of philology, the persistence of oak symbolism across these texts is hard to miss. Other Welsh manuscripts include phrases that appear to preserve older echoes, such as references to scions of oak from the grove, and lines suggesting that Druids once sang praises. Even if the poems were composed in a later age, the images may draw on a deeper reservoir of inherited symbolism. That is why some scholars have considered it plausible that when Druid religious authority vanished, parts of its cultural memory merged into bardic tradition. This does not prove that medieval bards preserved detailed pagan doctrine, but it does allow for the survival of themes, metaphors, and fragments of a worldview. Legal records complicate the picture again. The name of Druids does not clearly appear in the earliest Welsh law material, including texts associated with rulers of the 10th century. That absence does not settle the question, but it is another reminder that literary echoes and institutional reality are not the same thing. Place names in Wales are sometimes cited as evidence, yet they too can mislead. A famous name once thought to mean Stones of the Druids is now generally translated differently, removing the Druid connection entirely. Other names in Anglesey were interpreted in romantic ways as City of Astronomers or astronomer's circle. But modern scholarship often treats such readings as late and unreliable. Some antiquarian translations would likely find little support today. The Isle of Man remains a special case because it gathers both inscriptions and rich tradition. Early modern writers claimed that the island was a centre of northern Druidism, ruled by a presiding figure, and they repeated stories of kings sending sons there to be educated by Druids. These accounts are difficult to separate from legend, yet they may reflect a genuine older belief that man held religious importance. The island's deep association with ancient sea and sovereignty. Mythology may have encouraged such stories to grow. One Manx tradition describes a saint arriving while Druids were preparing a human sacrifice at a stone circle. In the story, a ritual act interrupts the sacrifice. The stone splits, and the victim escapes, while the Druids flee in fear. Whatever the historical value of such a narrative, it reveals how later Christian memory framed the victory over pagan rites, not through debate, but through miracle and flight. If the search turns to Scotland in the early Christian centuries, the trail becomes noticeably clearer. Compared with the thin and disputed hints for southern Britain, the Scottish record offers stronger narrative material, and it does so early. One of the first statements tied to this subject claims that a group described as Irish Pictish Druids were pushed out of Ireland and driven into Scotland. From these exiles, the account says, came spells, charms, omens, strange signs such as sneezes treated as portents, the supposed voices of birds, and every kind of magical reading of the world. In short, the tradition presents them as the source from which Scottish magic and divinatory practice flowed. By the later 6th century, a famous missionary arriving from Ireland is depicted facing a religious environment that strongly resembles the situation described in Ireland itself. The story says that he came with a clear goal: to turn the Picts from their ancestral religion toward Christianity. At the court of a powerful Pictish king, located somewhere in the northeastern highlands beyond Loch Ness, he is described encountering Druidic specialists attached to royal authority. The confrontation is portrayed not as quiet preaching, but as a struggle between competing sacred systems, staged through displays of power, signs and countersigns. The language of the narrative frames the encounter as a contest in which each side claims access to forces beyond an ordinary human control. A short declaration attributed to the missionary makes the conflict explicit. It rejects the idea that fate is determined by bird calls, by accidental bodily signs interpreted as omens, by the shape of trees, or by ritual gestures meant to direct destiny. In the same breath, it denies that these were proper objects of reverence at all. The statement closes by shifting devotion away from such signs and toward the Christian figure at the centre of the new faith. Whatever its precise origin, the speech captures the nature of the confrontation. The old order reads the world through signs. The new order condemns that reading and offers a different authority to replace it. At the king's hall, the leading opponent is named as a Druid who had served as the king's tutor. The narrative then shows the missionary stepping directly into territory the Druids considered their own. He converts and baptizes an entire household, an act presented as more than a private choice. It is treated as an assault on communal loyalty and religious allegiance. Soon afterward, one of the newly baptized falls gravely ill. The local Druids interpret the event as proof that abandoning the old gods invites punishment. The young man dies, and the story takes its most dramatic turn. He is brought back to life. The scene is crafted to deliver a simple message to its audience. The Christian side is shown not merely arguing against Druidic power, but outperforming it. The old religion accuses, the new religion reverses the verdict. Another episode pushes the rivalry into the realm of authority obedience, and personal freedom. The Druid tutor is said to keep an Irish woman in bondage. The missionary demands her release. When the request is refused, a warning follows. Refusal will bring fatal consequences. A sudden illness then falls on the Druid, described as a blow delivered by a higher spiritual agent. Messengers plead for help, and the missionary agrees on a condition. The captive must be freed. The Druid yields. A ritual act follows, involving water and a pale stone that behaves in a way the story presents as impossible. The ill man drinks and recovers. Once again, the structure of the narrative is clear. The older sacred specialist resists, suffers, submits, and is healed through the rival power. The same source offers a rare glimpse of what Pictish sacred practice looked like from the perspective of Christian storytelling. It describes a spring treated as holy and dangerous. Anyone who drank from it or bathed in it was said to suffer severe afflictions, including skin disease and loss of sight. Such effects are interpreted as the work of hostile spirits inhabiting the place. The missionary blesses the water, the spirits are driven out, and the spring becomes harmless. The underlying pattern appears repeatedly in conversion literature. Local sacred landscapes are acknowledged as real centres of power. But that power is reclassified as demonic and then symbolically defeated. The rivalry continues in yet another scene, set on the waters of Loch Ness. The Druid warns that if the missionary attempts a voyage, he will call up adverse winds and cover the journey in darkness. The saint sails anyway. A violent wind rises and darkness falls. Then a prayer is offered and the boat moves safely through the storm. The purpose of the episode is again straightforward. Druidic control over nature is asserted, then overridden. Even with these dramatic moments, the biographer offers surprisingly few detailed examples of individual conversions among the Picts. The missionary's success is portrayed less as a mass movement of baptized crowds and more as a shift at the level of power. He gains standing at the king's court, becomes a figure whose presence cannot be ignored, and the Druids fade from the centre of the stage. That disappearance should not be mistaken for proof that their religion was shallow. Some later historians tried to reduce the Pictish faith to mere superstition or crude magic, but such reduction does not fit the way the sources portray the conflict. The Druids object to conversion and baptism not as technicians of spells defending a monopoly, but as guardians of a sacred order defending their gods against a rival god. The argument is not simply about tricks and charms. It is about which divine authority should rule. There is also a political dimension. The missionary is credited not only with founding monasteries and communities, but with reshaping royal affairs in the Gaelic colony of Western Scotland until he could influence succession itself. Religious change and political change are shown moving together. Another story, more legendary than historical, claims that on arriving at Iona he encountered two Druids, disguised as Christian bishops, presenting themselves as founders of the faith on the island. He orders them to leave, and they obey. Later, commentators suggest the tale may reflect older disputes between different Christian models, rather than a literal Druidic masquerade. But the very existence of the story reveals how persistent the image of Druid rivals remained in the collective memory. Traditions also imply that figures called Druids were familiar in Scotland long before the 6th century. One story says an Irish king in the 3rd century summoned Druids to Scotland to work magic on his behalf against an enemy ruler. This does not prove institutions in the modern sense, but it suggests that the idea of Scottish Druids was not invented late, and that Scotland had long been imagined as part of a shared ritual world that stretched across the Irish Sea. Possible survivals in later Scotland add another layer. Some practices recorded centuries after conversion look like fragments of an older ritual pattern. In the 17th century, church authorities in the Highlands took action against people accused of sacrificing bulls on a fixed day in late August. The rite was outwardly explained as honouring a saint, yet the persistence of animal sacrifice in a Christian landscape raised suspicion. Another case, also recorded by church courts, describes a bull sacrifice on an island in a loch. The island contained the remains of a chapel, but beside it stood an oak tree that continued to receive offerings in the form of coins and nails driven into its trunk. The combination is striking. Sacred water, sacred enclosure, sacred oak, and a sacrificial animal. In some interpretations, the saint's name masks an older local divinity, and the ritual preserves an earlier structure of worship beneath a Christian surface. Local memory reinforces the impression. People in the district reportedly treated this figure not merely as a saint, but as something closer to a god. And the place itself was remembered as the Island of the King, or the Great King. Such phrases suggest a past in which a ruler or sacred figure associated with the place was treated as more than human. Some scholars have connected this to older European patterns of sacred kingship, where the fertility and well-being of a region are tied to an embodied power, sometimes mirrored in a sacrificial animal. In that framework, the bull could function as a vessel of the local spirit, offered in exchange for protection, health, or prosperity. A different Highland practice also deserves attention. A rite in which a seer wrapped himself in the hide of a freshly killed bull and sought visions near a waterfall or a cliff believed to be inhabited by spirits. This method of gaining knowledge about the future survived into the 18th century. Its logic matches what is known from Irish sources about divination and omen seeking, and there is even a hint of a similar motif in Welsh narrative, where a vision occurs while sleeping on an animal skin. Such parallels do not prove direct continuity, but they suggest a shared ritual vocabulary across Celtic regions. Place names in Scotland add still more, though they must be handled carefully. On Skye, small stone shelters that can barely hold a single person have been known as Druid's house, as if they were linked to solitary ritual specialists. Iona itself has been remembered in Gaelic with names that translate to Druid's Isle. These labels are difficult to dismiss as products of 18th century romantic fantasy, because they appear to belong to older local usage and do not fit the pattern of modern antiquarian invention. If they preserve anything at all, it may be the memory that pre-Christian ritual experts were once associated with these places. Some historians have argued that Druidism north of the Roman frontier had a simple explanation. Those regions were never fully controlled by Rome. Without sustained Roman administration, suppression would have been weaker, and older institutions could continue longer. In that light, the claim that Druidism survived among the Picts into the late 6th century becomes easier to accept. The discussion then turns naturally toward Ireland, where modern writers have sometimes treated Druidism as little more than crude magic or a faint echo of the Gallic system. That view has become common, but it is increasingly difficult to defend. The Irish evidence repeatedly shows Druids operating as an organised and influential class. They appear beside kings as advisors and judges, connected to law, war, ceremony, prophecy, and ritual. They are not portrayed only as spellcasters, but as figures embedded in political order. Some traditions even try to explain Ireland's connection to Druidism through origin stories. Druids arriving with legendary divine peoples, Druids belonging to successive waves of settlers, and Druids appearing among both the defenders of the land and those who later ruled it. In such narratives, the word Druid sometimes functions loosely, meaning a wise figure or magician, but the repeated association remains important. the Druids are placed close to sovereignty and close to the sacred. This is where the link to kingship becomes crucial. Irish tradition ties major royal ceremonies to sacred objects, including the stone connected with the enthronement of high kings. Druids are associated with that system, and the system itself resembles a model in which rulership is not merely political, but religious. The king's legitimacy is tied to ritual, and ritual is tied to a landscape of divine power. The Irish mythic pantheon, presented as godlike ancestors and supernatural rulers, is also tied to the Druidic world. That connection is often overlooked, yet it supports the argument that Irish Druidism functioned as a religion, not merely as a trade in charms. Claims that Irish Druidism was simply imported from Gaul have been made, but they often rest on the narrow idea that Druids were mainly magicians everywhere. Once the wider evidence is considered, that premise weakens. Ireland also shows signs of coordination in religious life, including major assemblies, held at fixed times, which suggests organisation rather than scattered individual practitioners. Some interpreters have even argued that Druids served the rhythm of a wider festival system that connects Ireland to older continental patterns. Some modern scholars have been cautious, even dismissive, about what can truly be known of early Druidism in Ireland. One influential Celtic linguist, MacBain, argued that there is no straightforward evidence from the period when the tradition was alive. In his view, references to Druids appear mainly after Christianity is firmly rooted and the older religion has already become distant memory. By then, the writers describing Druids are Christian clerics and chroniclers, and they portray them in a narrow way, as court magicians, diviners, and tricksters attached to pagan kings. MacBain insists that Irish tales and annals rarely present Druidism as a coherent religion or a serious body of thought. In his reading, the Irish Druid is typically a conjurer, sometimes little more than a performer of marvels. That conclusion, however, depends heavily on the angle from which the surviving stories were recorded. Christian authors naturally recast their rivals as frauds and sorcerers, just as the older ritual specialists would have regarded the new missionaries as dangerous workers of strange power. Many conversion stories in Ireland are built around public contests of supernatural authority. Druids challenge missionaries, missionaries respond, and the narrative almost always awards victory to the Christian side. An outsider with no knowledge of Christian theology, someone reading only for the surface action, could easily come away with the impression that Christianity was simply the stronger magical craft. From that perspective, the religion would appear to be nothing more than a set of occult techniques. This is the core weakness in MacBain's framing, judging a belief system by hostile retellings that are designed to prove the superiority of an opponent. MacBain goes further and argues that Irish Druids could not have formed a true priestly order. That claim has been repeated often, yet it rests more on assumption than demonstration. To his credit, he admits that older echoes sometimes break through the later storytelling. Now and then, the sources hint at a period when Druidism in Ireland and Scotland looked different and included severe rites, including the offering of human lives. To illustrate that point, MacBain brings up the famous Iona story, associated with Saint Columba and Saint Oran, in which a human being is buried beneath a church foundation. Even if that narrative is treated as legend or moralized tale, it complicates the easy division between civilized Christianity and barbarous paganism. It also exposes the danger of interpreting every wonder-working episode as proof that the underlying religion lacked real doctrine. Miracles and violent legends can be used to smear rivals, but they can also rebound against the storyteller. Another careful observer, Kendrick, takes a more measured position. He suggests that it is at least possible that Ireland once had an authoritative priestly tradition, perhaps even older than the arrival of Celtic culture in its final form. He stresses that Christian filtering may have left only a damaged residue of earlier reality. When legends are preserved by a religion that disapproves of what it describes, the result is rarely a fair portrait. Kendrick also points out a clue that seems hard to ignore. The Irish Druids appear repeatedly in connection with the rhythm of seasonal festivals. That link is not a minor detail. A priesthood is often defined by its custody of sacred time, public rites, and communal ceremonies. A group consistently tied to such functions cannot be reduced to isolated fortune tellers without losing something essential. Debate also surrounds the sacred tree at the heart of the tradition. Some writers have claimed that Irish Druids did not treat the oak as special and instead elevated the mountain ash. Yet Irish literature does contain repeated references that cast the oak as a tree of high status and sacred association. Even Kendrick, who tends to see Irish Druidism as a weaker reflection of the Gallic model that later became cut off and diminished, still treats the evidence as more complex than a simple picture of wandering conjurers. His view is sometimes considered generous by modern standards, but it still falls short of the fuller religious role suggested by many Irish sources. Irish tradition itself often distinguishes between different layers inside the learned class. Druids are not portrayed as a single uniform type. The picture that emerges is closer to a system with roles and ranks. One strand points toward a priestly function, connected to public ritual and sacred authority. Another strand points toward a learned caste of poets and seers, figures who combine prophecy, memory, and instruction. This second group, often described as trained poets, appears to have endured longer than the more strictly ritual priesthood. In many cultures, the poetic and legal memory of an older religion outlives its temples. The same seems to have happened here. Records speak of training systems, structured learning, and long curricula that survived late into the historical period. Education for nobles and royal households is repeatedly linked with these learned specialists, suggesting something closer to an institution than an assortment of independent spellworkers. Old stories also include details that fit priestly responsibility. Druids appear tending sacred fires connected to seasonal celebrations. They are associated with rites performed on appointed days. Not only with private charms, there are also references suggesting that images of gods existed and were honoured in some form. Yet even scholars who collected such details sometimes concluded that there was no positive worship, as if rites, fires, images, and festival service could exist without religion behind them. That conclusion is difficult to sustain once the broader structure is considered. The strongest indication of the Druidic position in Ireland appears in its link to kingship. Irish kingship is repeatedly described as more than political command. The ruler is expected to guarantee order in nature and society. The success of crops, the increase of cattle, and even the fertility of the people. Ceremonies surrounding royal selection and inauguration reflect this worldview. In the material that survives, the learned and ritual class stands close to that process. If the rites of kingship were supervised by Druids, then their role cannot be reduced to entertainment or private divination. It becomes part of how the society understood power, legitimacy, and the health of the land itself. Many older academic judgments about Irish Druids were formed before the wider comparative study of sacred rulership became influential. Once that framework is applied, the question changes. A priesthood tied to royal inauguration and the maintenance of sacred order looks very different from a handful of conjurers. Several modern writers have already conceded that earlier views may need revision, because the relationship between ritual authority and kingship provides a more plausible explanation for the Druids' influence and their repeated appearance near thrones. Irish literature does include hostile lines aimed at Druids, sometimes spoken by characters presented as noble or divine. These passages describe Druid power fading, their speech being silenced, their spells losing force, and their craft being denounced as dark deception. Yet the tone often resembles Christian moralizing more than neutral memory. Such speeches read like the work of later editors, reshaping older tales to fit a new religious worldview. Other narratives portray conflict between kings and Druids in dramatic terms. One king is said to have tried to restrain Druidic influence and is punished through a supernatural mechanism engineered by a Druid and a demon. Another ruler is described as an early Christian convert, while his son refuses to abandon ancestral religion and is struck down by lightning. These stories may not be reliable history, but they reveal how the tradition framed religious transition as a dangerous struggle with immediate consequences, not as a slow change of opinion. Local legend adds another layer. At Loaf Derg, people have long told stories that the lake and its island were the final refuge of the Druids. Beneath the island, the legend says, lie twisting underground chambers where strange rites were performed and visions were sought. Whether those tales preserve any memory of initiation practices is uncertain. But it is notable that the site gained wide fame in the Middle Ages. Places that later become centres of Christian pilgrimage sometimes stand on top of earlier, sacred geographies. Not because the old writers survived intact, but because the location itself retained an aura of power. Other anecdotes point to a blurred period where old and new overlapped. One Irish king is described as partly aligned with Druid practice and partly aligned with Christianity, and he wages war when a sacred cow is destroyed. Such a detail matters because it suggests that certain animals were protected by religious sanction, not merely by economic value. Irish tradition also refers to groups of women connected with ritual knowledge, described as colleges of druidesses, reinforcing the sense of a structured sacred world rather than isolated practitioners. The status of the oak returns again and again in this material. Some authorities have insisted that the oak held no special place in Irish sacred practice. Yet early law lists noble trees that carried strict protections, and the oak is among them. Its cutting could incur severe penalties, a sign that the tree was more than timber. Stories also connect major religious figures with the fear of hearing an axe in a sacred grove at Derry, a fear described as deeper than the fear of death itself. Such a line only makes sense in a culture where certain groves carried intense sanctity. Many Irish place names likewise preserve the oak in a sacred or ceremonial context. All of these details become more persuasive when placed side by side. Separately, each might be dismissed as legend, poetry, or late interpretation. Together, they sketch a consistent picture, an organised body tied to seasonal rites, to royal ceremony, to the education of elites, and to protected sacred landscapes. Magic and omen reading are clearly part of that picture, but they sit inside a larger system rather than replacing it. The Druids appear not only as fortune tellers, but as counsellors of kings, guardians of ritual order, and holders of specialised training. From the evidence already reviewed and from what later chapters would supply in a full treatment, a cautious summary emerges. Irish Druids can reasonably be described as a defined religious class with specific ceremonies. They stand close to sacred kingship and its public rites. They practice divination and ritual power. They instruct noble youth through structured learning. They participate in seasonal festivals marked by sacred fires. They recognize the oak as one of the trees of the high sacred grove. They repeatedly appear as advisors to rulers across a wide range of early literature. What has been stated so far is best treated as groundwork, rather than a final verdict, because the fullest weight of the evidence only becomes visible when each aspect of belief and practice is examined in detail. Beyond the Atlantic edges of Europe, one more intriguing possibility appears. In Asia Minor, a Celtic group known as the Galatians established themselves in the 3rd century before the Christian era. Their central meeting place carried a Celtic name, meaning the sacred oak grove. There, 12 leading rulers met annually, accompanied by a large council of lesser officials. One ancient author describes sacrifices offered under the name of a Greek goddess, though the figure behind the name may have been a local Celtic divinity, interpreted through a classical lens. The oak association, however, is hard to miss. The name of the assembly site itself points toward an oak grove tradition carried from Europe into Anatolia. Whether these rulers also functioned as priests in a Druidic sense cannot be proven with certainty, because the surviving evidence is thin. Yet the structure of the gathering, the sacred grove name, and the persistence of oak symbolism make it difficult to dismiss the possibility entirely. A similar pattern may have existed in Gaul as well. A late antique churchman and poet refers to a place whose ancient name, in the language of the Gauls, seems to mean a great sanctuary or sacred grove. Another historian preserves comparable place name elements. These scattered traces suggest that even after official suppression, the vocabulary of sacred groves, and perhaps memories of their ritual importance, lingered long in the landscape and in names people continue to use. The Druids are treated here as a real priesthood, not as a loose crowd of fortune-tellers. The debate usually turns on a modern habit of separating a priest from magician, as if those roles could not coexist. Yet in many early religions, the same specialists handled sacrifice, public ritual, healing, omen reading, and acts that later ages would label magic. Egyptian temple experts, Babylonian ritualists, early Indian priestly families, and even the religious officials of Greece and Rome all performed rites, meant to influence unseen powers, avert danger, or secure prosperity. They are still called priests. If that double function is accepted for the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, it becomes hard to justify calling Druids only shamans or witch doctors, while denying them priestly status. A common reply is that Egypt or Greece eventually developed richer philosophical traditions and more refined spiritual language. But those traditions did not begin as polished systems. They grew over long periods, changing as societies changed. Druidism, too, appears to have been suppressed while it was still evolving. Some interpretations argue that the tradition was cut down precisely at a moment when it might have moved further toward a more developed theology or moral philosophy. Ancient writers certainly speak of Druids with unusual respect for a people outside the classical world. Roman poets and commentators sometimes describe them as thinkers and interpreters of nature. Early Christian writers, even while opposing pagan worship, occasionally sound as if they regard Druid teachings as serious enough to be discussed rather than dismissed as pure fraud. If Druids are denied the label priests, then consistency would demand stripping the same label from many early religious officials elsewhere. Clement of Alexandria, for example, groups Druids alongside the religious specialists of Egypt and the Near East. That comparison matters because it shows how educated observers in late antiquity classified them. Another consistent feature in the sources is that Druid communities did not function as one flat group. Duties appear divided. Some officiated at ritual, some taught, some memorized and performed poetry, Some adjudicated disputes and handled legal traditions. Some were healers, a system with specialized roles, public authority, and formal training. Looks far closer to a priestly institution than to a handful of private charm sellers. The evidence for such internal division shows up across several regions where Druids are reported, though Scotland leaves fewer explicit details on this particular point. There is also a broader issue of unity. However different local customs may have been, the tradition is often described as sharing a recognizable core from place to place. The picture suggested by the sources is not of unrelated village sorcerers, but of a body with a shared discipline and a recognizable set of practices. Regional variations likely existed, as they do in most religions, but the overall pattern points toward a common tradition that moved across Celtic-speaking communities. In Gaul, recruitment from the upper ranks stands out. Julius Caesar describes Druids as one of the two groups of people who carried real status and influence. Their pupils are likewise presented as drawn from prominent families. Other Roman writers speak of disciples as belonging to the noblest circles. The portrait is consistent. These were not marginal figures operating on society's edges, but members of an elite religious and legal class. Caesar also speaks of a single leader holding supreme authority among them. He does not give a formal title for that leader, but he describes succession. At a leader's death, the most distinguished candidate might take the position, or an election might be held, and sometimes violence decided the outcome. Whatever the exact mechanics, the description implies a structured institution with recognized hierarchy. Ireland produces later claims of chief Druids at royal courts, and some texts describe prominent Druids converting to Christianity. Tradition also attaches similar titles to other places, including the Isle of Man. Yet caution is necessary because later chroniclers often liked to organise the past into neat offices and ranks, and modern writers sometimes amplify that tendency. Even so, the repeated appearance of leading Druids at courts suggests that some form of senior authority existed, whether formally named or not. Classical authors also hint at multiple categories of religious specialists. In Gaul, Caesar describes Druids mainly as a religious body that also judges disputes and interprets sacred matters. He does not single out a separate class of bards. Other writers do. Diodorus distinguishes poets who compose verse, theologians and philosophers called Druids, and diviners. Strabo lists bards, diviners, and Druids as honoured groups, describing Druids as arbiters in disputes and students of moral and natural inquiry. Ammianus repeats a threefold division with different terminology, again implying separate learned roles. Some scholars have argued that these labels overlap, describing the same people from different angles, while others treat them as distinct orders. The very fact that several independent writers present a layered, learned world strengthens the idea of an institutional religious culture, not a single occupation reduced to trickery. In Ireland, the surviving literature frequently shows Druids acting as ritual specialists, teachers, and workers of omen and spell. It also points to a higher poetic learned class, often described as trained poets and prophets, who outlasted the older Druid role after Christianization. Across time, the poetic class becomes the more visible survivor. That survival pattern is familiar. When a religion is suppressed, public ritual offices disappear first, while learned tradition can persist in literature, genealogy, satire, praise poetry, and legal memory. A broad correspondence is often proposed between Gaul and Ireland. The Druids, the diviners, and the bards appear in both settings under different names. Some authorities deny the neatness of that comparison, and they also deny that Irish Druids were truly priests. Yet the Irish material has an obvious complication. Christian editors had every reason to silence or soften references to pagan ritual worship. In many texts, explicit sacrificial detail is reduced or reshaped, while magical episodes remain because they can be used to portray pagan rivals as deceivers defeated by saints. That imbalance can create a false impression that Druids were only magicians. The poetic cast deserves special attention because it shaped memory. In Gaul, ancient writers describe bards celebrating famous deeds in song using instruments and formal verse. Irish tradition echoes this, though with additional emphasis on satire and praise as social weapons. Some Irish poets are shown entering ecstatic states and producing both poetry and prophecy, as if inspiration and divination flowed together. Training is described as long and demanding. Poetic meters are many. Knowledge includes story cycles, genealogies, language study, and mastery of older scripts. The tradition also preserves the idea of spells and formal incantations as part of professional education, ranging from practical charms to rites meant to influence fate. Such details suggest that learning, ritual speech, and perceived supernatural effectiveness were interwoven in the professional identity of the learned class. Texts that describe degrees and examinations show how formal this world could be. Compositions are submitted to recognized masters. Moral qualification is emphasized alongside technical skill. The ruler's court appears as the place that recognizes status and grants official standing. Even if these descriptions cannot be accepted as exact administrative records, they reflect a society that understood learned authority as something tested, ranked, and publicly acknowledged. This helps explain why Druids and poets could exercise real influence. Stories exaggerate it, but the exaggeration depends on a foundation that audiences considered believable. Some narratives illustrate the extreme privilege of poets. A famous tale tells of a poet making outrageous demands from kings and receiving them because refusal was unthinkable. The story is clearly shaped for drama, yet it captures a consistent idea. The learned voice could compel elites. That kind of social power is difficult to reconcile with the image of mere entertainers or marginal charm workers. Classical literature also preserves puzzling titles attached to Celtic seers. One source mentions semnotheoi alongside Druids in a way that has sparked speculation. Some interpret it as a special term meaning venerable or ancient, possibly linked to old tribal names. Others wonder if it points to a different group in a different region, such as Galatia in Asia Minor. The uncertainty itself is important. It shows that outsiders struggled to map Celtic institutions onto Greek and Roman categories. Not every foreign term was understood, and not every label can be cleanly decoded today. A more concrete problem appears with the title Gutuatri, known from inscriptions in Roman-era Gaul. These inscriptions likely refer to officials of the Romanized local religion that took shape after Druidism was suppressed. They seem to be temple or shrine functionaries serving a Latinized public cult, not the old Druid order in its independent form. Some scholars have proposed that Gutuatri were a subordinate branch of the earlier system, like local ministers, while others argue they belong to the post-conquest religious administration. The evidence leans toward the latter, especially because the inscriptional record belongs to a period when Rome had reshaped civic religion. Ancient narratives that appear to mention a gutuator may involve confusion between a title and a personal name, and later, writers could easily blur the distinction. The question returns then to the simplest test. What do the sources say Druids actually did? Caesar's description is direct. Druids are presented as responsible for sacred matters, for public and private sacrifices, and for interpreting religious rules. He even contrasts them with Germans, saying the Germans had no Druids to oversee worship. That contrast only makes sense if Druids in Gaul did in fact oversee worship. Other authors reinforce this. Diodorus portrays them as theologians and philosophers, and insists that no sacrifice took place without their involvement, because they were believed to understand the divine. Strabo echoes this view. Pomponius Mela says they claimed knowledge of the will of the gods and taught doctrines about the soul's survival. Lucan speaks of their holy rites. Pliny calls them priests, while also describing them as practitioners of magic. Tacitus references their altars. Taken together, these descriptions point toward a body that performed ritual worship, guarded sacred knowledge, and held recognized authority in religion. Some Christian writers go even further, claiming that Druids worshipped a single god. That claim may reflect misunderstanding or theological framing, but it shows that Druids were considered a religious body, not merely technicians of spellcraft. Modern scholars who look closely at the evidence often accept the priestly core while emphasizing that Druids were not limited to priestly tasks. Kendrick, for example, describes them as priests and more than priests. He treats them as aligned with the broader Celtic religious world, connected to the many gods known across Celtic regions, and tied to the seasonal festival cycle. Other scholars link the Druids to an oak-centered cult tradition. A leading French authority argues that the analogy between Druids and ancient priesthoods is strong, while also highlighting a distinctive feature. Druids across tribes appear connected through a persistent federation, something closer to a church-like network than the typical civic priesthoods of the classical Mediterranean. A structure of that kind would naturally produce hierarchy and regular assemblies. Another major modern interpreter argues that in Gaul, and at least partly in Ireland, Druids formed a priestly corporation without being a monastic community. They did not necessarily live in cloisters, but they shared rites and maintained common cult practices. The same author notes a basic historical point. Christian missionaries treated Druids as their main religious opponents. That opposition is difficult to explain if Druids were not the priests of the pagan religion. If Druids were merely entertainers and charm workers, then the question becomes obvious. Who performed public religious duties in pagan Ireland and Gaul? The missionary stories make sense only if Druids represented the religious authority that Christianity needed to replace. Other experienced researchers are blunt. The evidence for sacrificial priesthood is strong. Older Irish historians describe Druids as regulators of worship, sacrifices, and diviners acting for the benefit of the king and the land. That description captures the combined roles that appear repeatedly in early societies, maintaining ritual order, advising rulers, and interpreting fate. It also explains why Druids would be embedded in law, education, and social governance, rather than confined to private magic. Comparative scholarship adds one more perspective. Some have compared Druid organization to Roman religious brotherhoods connected with agriculture, kingship, and expiatory rites in sacred groves. In Rome, damaging a sacred grove could require atonement rituals. Trees struck by lightning could trigger formal responses. These parallels do not prove identity, but they show that grove-centered ritual and institutional priesthood can coexist in complex societies. Arguments against Druid priesthood often rely on narrow definitions and selective reading. One critic suggests Druids should be treated as philosophers and diviners, separate from the ordinary religion of the Gauls, as if that separation solved the problem. Another claims that no customs or survivals can be tied to Druid practice. a claim that depends on ignoring the effects of suppression and Christian rewriting. In Ireland, one influential collector concluded there was no reason to treat Druids as priests of any positive worship. Yet the same Irish literature that preserves magical episodes also contains repeated hints of festival fires, sacred trees, protected groves, public council, and royal ritual contexts. The collector was also limited by the material available in edited texts and by the lack of a broader comparative framework, especially the role of sacral kingship. A reader who considers how Christian redactors shaped the sources and who compares Ireland with the continent is less likely to accept the idea that Druids were only magicians. There seems to be no convincing reason to deny the Druids the name priests. Calling them that does not erase the fact that they also acted as advisors, judges, healers, teachers, and diviners. In practice, religious specialists in early societies rarely stayed inside a narrow spiritual role. Whenever a priesthood was given access to public authority, it tended to use it. Comparative studies of religion also point to an older pattern in which sacred authority and royal authority were once closely bound together, sometimes even embodied in the same person. If that is broadly true, then a later, more developed priestly class would naturally remain close to kingship, even if the political shape of society changed. The strongest objections to Druid priesthood often come from writers trained to trust only material traces. That approach is valuable for many questions, but it does not automatically produce expert judgment about how ancient religions organized themselves, or how religious power operated. On the question of organization, one influential modern view holds that the Druid order in Gaul operated on something like a national scale. The sources describe assemblies held at fixed times and at recognized central places, and this suggests coordination beyond the level of a single tribe. The same view argues that Druids accepted a senior authority, often imagined as an arch-leader, and that the order was not constantly torn by intertribal rivalry. Their influence is described as heavy, especially because they trained young elites, and because their decisions carried a religious weight that made disobedience costly. Nothing in this picture requires the Druids to be isolated mystics, living apart from ordinary life. A useful glimpse comes from a Roman account of a prominent Gallic Druid who moved easily in political society and was known for studying the natural world and making forecasts by reading signs or by careful reasoning. That kind of figure looks less like a village conjurer and more like a public religious intellectual with political standing. Ireland also offers hints of large-scale coordination. Accounts of major gatherings held on set dates and attended by people from far away imply that Irish Druid life was not only local and scattered. In Gaul, Druids are said to have been exempt from military service, which fits the idea of a recognized class set apart for public religious and legal duties. Over time, roles appear to have separated into specialties. What may have begun as one broad learned calling seems to have developed into distinct functions such as ritual officiant, seer, and poet. Even then, rigid boundaries are unlikely. Remote districts and small shrines could not have supported separate officials for every sacred tree, spring, grove, and village. In such places, a single practitioner would almost certainly combine multiple roles, especially the ritual role and the divinatory one. One detail in Caesar's description shows how closely religion and law could be linked. Druids are presented as judges in disputes and arbiters in serious cases. They could also impose a severe penalty on anyone who refused to accept a verdict. The penalty was exclusion from sacrifice. In effect, legal defiance became religious exile. That mechanism only makes sense inside a system where public worship mattered and where control of access to ritual was a real form of power. It also shows how the priestly function could reinforce the judicial one, turning religious participation into a lever of social discipline. The Druids were not portrayed as a celibate caste. They are described as a tightly bound fellowship, yet nothing suggests that marriage was forbidden. Some modern theories once tried to cast them as monk-like figures living in communal isolation, but the evidence does not require it. A corporate association can exist without monastic life. Irish material even hints that in certain places priestly roles could pass through families, with sons following fathers, a pattern that appears in other early religious settings as well. Mentions of the children of Druids in Irish stories fit that possibility, even if the details cannot be treated like formal administrative records. Descriptions of dress and insignia are frustratingly thin, but they are not absent. One classical writer describes Druids wearing richly patterned clothing with gold embroidery and golden neck rings. That sounds like elite ceremonial dress rather than the plain costume of wandering ascetics. Later speculation often assigns fixed colours to different classes, but firm evidence for a neat colour code is weak. Irish tales, meanwhile, present Druids in striking outfits designed for story impact. Cloaks, described as speckled or bright, gold ornaments, and dramatic headpieces used in scenes of magical competition. Pliny's famous description of mistletoe cutting implies a white ceremonial garment and bare feet for a particular rite, suggesting that special clothing could be tied to specific sacred acts. Other stories describe opponents of Christian saints wearing white, sometimes with the narrative explanation that they were imitating holy men. Whether that explanation is fair or not, the repeated appearance of white clothing in ritual contexts suggests that brightness and purity symbolism mattered in ceremonial display. Sandals are also mentioned in Irish epic tradition, another small detail that helps ground the imagery in everyday material culture. The question of a distinctive tonsure is another place where small details open a larger argument. Some scholars propose that an unusual haircut used by early Christian clergy in parts of Britain and Ireland may preserve an older, pre-Christian pattern. One hostile Christian writer describes a tonsure that shaved the front of the head from ear to ear, leaving the back hair intact. Roman critics mocked it and tried to associate it with infamous heresy, but the dispute itself shows that the style was real and noticeable. Later, church correspondence also mentions this debated haircut and contrasts it with the Roman crown-like tonsure. The front-shaved form seems to have persisted among certain Christian communities for centuries, and the timing raises the possibility that it was inherited from older local custom. Irish legend then complicates the picture by treating a famous biblical-era magician as if he were a druid, largely because Latin terms for magician were sometimes used to translate or describe druid-like figures. In stories, this outsider becomes linked to Irish magical technology and flying devices, blending Christian polemic, local myth, and the old habit of explaining the unfamiliar through familiar labels. Whatever the truth behind the legend, it shows how easily Druid identity could be reframed inside later religious storytelling. A final issue concerns initiation. Direct evidence for a formal Druid initiation ceremony is thin, and opinions differ partly because the topic invites fantasy. Still, certain sober observations can be made. Caesar says that sacred teachings were transmitted orally and guarded from public circulation. That secrecy does not automatically mean a dramatic mystery cult, but it does suggest levels of access, training, and controlled knowledge. In many societies, secret teaching is protected not because it is abstract philosophy, but because spoken formulas, ritual actions, and sacred narratives are believed to lose force if treated as common property. Some ancient writers also preserve a short moral formula associated with Druid teaching. Worship the gods, avoid wrongdoing, and cultivate courage. If that summary reflects anything real, it would likely have been accompanied by cosmological stories, sacred histories, ritual speech, and practical religious rules. Welsh tradition introduces a different kind of evidence, indirect and hard to interpret. Certain poems and mythic narratives describe novices undertaking perilous symbolic actions, including voyages on water and tests where the outcome is treated as a measure of worth. One account places a candidate in a small boat and frames the sea as a judge of character, implying a ritual trial rather than ordinary travel. Another cluster of poems connects inspiration to a sacred vessel or cauldron, guarded by a goddess figure associated with knowledge and transformation. Some verses also hint at ceremonial bathing or immersion linked to a change of status. Elsewhere, a story describes a figure confined in a strange otherworldly fortress or prison and emerging with the lifelong identity of a prophetic poet, a pattern that resembles initiation by ordeal. Even an apparently simple scene, where legendary heroes speak with a guardian in a sanctuary that feels like a grove, can be read as the narrative shadow of ritual dialogue at a sacred boundary. None of this proves, in a strict sense, that Druids operated mysteries identical to those of Greece. Yet the parallels are tempting because Greek mystery cults did include ritual movement to water, symbolic and purification, and staged experiences meant to transform the participant. The Welsh material does not name Druids in these episodes, and the texts are difficult because translation and transmission are complicated. But the repeated themes, secrecy, ordeal, purification, guarded knowledge, transformation into poet-prophet, fit the wider Celtic religious world in which Druids served as officiants and guardians of tradition. The safest conclusion is that later Welsh myth preserves scattered, stylized memories of hidden knowledge practices. Those practices might descend from older native religion, or they might reflect later cultural influence, or they might be a blend of both. Direct identification with Druid ritual cannot be claimed with confidence, but the atmosphere of initiation-like testing is difficult to dismiss entirely. Ancient writers who try to describe the Druids almost always return to one striking detail: training. Caesar says that many young men entered the order by choice, while others were sent by their families, and that the work began with memory. A candidate was expected to learn an enormous body of verse by heart, and the commitment could last close to 20 years. The implication is clear. In that world, a Druid was not made by a quick ceremony, but by years of disciplined learning, where knowledge lived in the mind and in the voice rather than on parchment. Another Roman author repeats the same idea and adds a setting. Instruction carried on away from public view in places that were quiet and hard to reach, such as sheltered valleys or natural hollows in the land. Whether those details were observed directly or borrowed from earlier reports, they match the larger picture of a tradition that treated its teachings as privileged material, passed from teacher to student with care. Later, Irish tradition fills in the kind of education such a system might require. Training is described as happening both in groups and in one-to-one settings, and it is not limited to boys. Stories speak of high-born young women receiving instruction, which suggests that learning could be a form of status as well as a spiritual or magical pursuit. The student path is often presented as long and staged. First came years devoted to foundational skills, mastering long narratives, learning rules of speech, memorizing genealogies, and gaining command of formal language. Study also included law and moral judgment, because public authority depended on knowing how disputes were settled and how leaders were advised. Poetry mattered even more than modern readers expect. It was not treated as entertainment, but as a trained art tied to memory, persuasion, and the ability to shape a public message. Only after that groundwork does tradition place the student in more specialized territory, where the focus turns toward divination, ritual knowledge, and the techniques of controlled speech used for blessings, curses, and formal declarations. Some accounts go further and describe the pursuit of a secret, learned idiom associated with poets, a way of speaking that marked the initiated and made their craft harder to imitate. Irish narrative even attaches named teachers to famous pupils. A royal household is said to have appointed 2 learned men to educate the king's daughters, and in another tradition a future saint receives early instruction from a Druid before beginning his own religious path. The heroic cycle pushes the theme farther. A celebrated warrior is placed under the guidance of a renowned instructor who is portrayed as both scholar and seer. When the grown hero is later asked what he gained from that education, the answer is not simply skill with weapons. It is knowledge of the sacred arts linked to the old gods and the ability to interpret visions and dreams. In other words, the training is framed as a mixed discipline, part religious worldview, part practical technique, part mastery of symbolic language. From this angle, it becomes easier to understand why Druids appear so often as gatekeepers of elite education. Some Irish commentators claimed that public advancement required instruction of this kind, and even if that is an exaggeration, the pattern is consistent. Rulers and noble families are repeatedly shown relying on Druids as teachers. A modern historian tried to soften the claim by saying that it is misleading to picture formal schools in the later institutional sense. Yet the correction still keeps the core intact. Learned masters gathered young aristocrats around them and taught everything they believed about the world, the soul, and the gods. Those who aimed for religious office stayed longest and received the most concentrated attention. The system may not have looked like a classroom, but it still functioned as an educational network tied to prestige and authority. The question of colleges is where imagination often runs ahead of evidence. Some writers have pictured a fully structured academic system with buildings, ranks, examinations, and degrees, almost like a monastery or a medieval university. The older sources do not require that. They speak, instead of secluded instruction, of groups formed around teachers and of communities that could appear wherever learning was concentrated. Irish chronicles mention places whose names imply gatherings of learned people, and later Christian sites are sometimes said to stand on older sacred centres, including places where a holy fire was maintained by women before the rise of the church. It is difficult to tell how much of this reflects real continuity and how much reflects later storytelling that tries to give ancient roots to sacred landscapes. Traditions about colleges of priestesses at various mounds and hills often feel especially late and decorative, because they appear alongside confident claims about caves and hidden chambers that cannot be dated by the tradition itself. Welsh material adds another layer of confusion. A shadowy brotherhood associated with secret books, unusual arts, and a hidden stronghold on a mountain appears in scattered references. Some later writers inflate these hints into the claim that such a group maintained a college centuries before Oxford existed, which is clearly the kind of assertion that grows when legend is repeated often enough to acquire a false solidity. The most that can be said is that Welsh tradition preserved the idea of arcane specialists and secret knowledge, sometimes linked to technical skill, such as metalworking. Connecting that directly to Druids is much harder, and the safest approach is to treat it as a parallel stream of myth-making, rather than clear evidence of a Druid institution. Another puzzle concerns writing. Caesar famously says that sacred teaching was not written down, and yet he also notes that Druids could use the Greek alphabet for practical purposes. Irish stories go farther and portray Druids reading Ogham inscriptions, leaving messages in Ogham and being called upon as the only people able to interpret such markings when others could not. This sits uneasily beside the image of a purely oral system. The tension may be resolved by a simple distinction. Certain kinds of knowledge could be written, while the most valued teachings were deliberately kept in memory and performance. Later, Christian tradition tells dramatic stories of large-scale book burnings, where Druid texts are destroyed as part of a campaign against pagan learning. The numbers given in these tales vary wildly, and the tone is often rhetorical, designed to display zeal rather than to record an inventory. Still, the persistence of the theme suggests that early Christian writers wanted their audience to believe that a rival intellectual tradition had been defeated not only in debate, but also by the elimination of its written traces. In some narratives, even a public contest is staged in which sacred books are thrown into water, and the book that remains readable is treated as proof of religious truth. The point of such scenes is not the realism of the test, but the symbolism. Authority is granted to the tradition that can survive the trial. Beyond teaching, the Druids are repeatedly shown as judges. Caesar's description is detailed. They handle disputes in both public and private life, from crimes and murders to inheritance and boundary conflicts. They assign penalties and rewards, and they hold a power that reaches beyond law into ritual. Anyone who refuses to accept a judgment can be barred from sacrifice, a punishment described as the harshest available, because it turns a person into an outsider in both religion and society. Those who are excluded are shunned, treated as polluted, and denied access to the normal protections of communal justice. In this system, court and sanctuary are not separate. Legal authority and religious participation reinforce each other, and the Druid's role sits at the hinge. Some later scholars argued that the great Druid tribunal at a central Gallic site was already losing its force in the final decades before Roman conquest, perhaps becoming a fading survival rather than a living institution. That is possible, but the cause matters. One explanation often proposed is the weakening of older sacred kingship structures. If the Druids' authority was intertwined with the older model of divine or semi-divine rule, then political disruption would naturally erode the institutions that depended on it. Other scholars try to define the fines and compensations that such judges imposed, imagining a structured system where one payment punished the offender while another compensated the injured family. Others suggested that the most serious cases followed a hard logic of retaliation. Reports of execution by fire appear in ancient commentary, sometimes framed as sacrifice that pleased the gods and even aided fertility. That last claim is revealing because it links law, death, ritual, and agriculture into a single worldview. The judge is also a ritual specialist, and punishment becomes part of cosmic maintenance. Greek and Roman authors also credit Druids with an unusual public function: stopping violence. Accounts describe them stepping between armed forces as battles were about to begin, calming combatants with words and presence, as if men on the verge of killing could be held in check by recognized authority. Similar statements claim that they once arbitrated even in wartime disputes. Irish tradition does not emphasize this pacifying role in the same way, and at times presents Druids as combatants, or as supernatural opponents engaged in direct conflict. A Druid can appear as a herald delivering demands for tribute, or as an active participant in mythic war. The contrast may reflect differences in sources and genres rather than a clean historical difference. But it is worth noting, the Druid is not always portrayed as a peacemaker. In some traditions, he is also a weapon. Healing is another recurring thread. Druid medicine is often presented as herbal and ritual at once. Plants are gathered with strict rules about timing, posture, and which hand must be used. A remedy is not only a substance, but an action performed correctly. Mistletoe appears as a famous antidote and treatment. Other plants are said to protect against accidents, cure eye trouble, drive away fever, or prevent harm to cattle. Later, rural customs in parts of France show a similar pattern, where a plant used for livestock is gathered on a saint's day, with ceremony and then blessed by a priest. Such examples make it difficult to separate medicine from charm in traditional practice because the same action can be described either way, depending on the storyteller's worldview. Irish sagas also assign Druids a medical role. A hero's household expects that a Druid can find the hidden cause of sickness. In another episode, poisoned wounds are treated not by surgery, but by ritual bathing in milk from white cattle, after which the wounded recover. Whether these scenes reflect real practice or mythic symbolism, they show that the Druids' authority extended into crisis moments where life and death were at stake. Some later writers also claim that Druids served as genealogists and keepers of records, preserving descent lines and the memory of expeditions. The statement is difficult to prove directly, but it fits the logic of a learned caste in an oral society. Whoever trains the elite and speaks in formal settings tends to become the keeper of pedigrees, claims, and histories. Even when the record is legendary, the social role is coherent. Then there is the question of women. References to female religious specialists appear so often that they cannot simply be dismissed, but their status is unclear. Some inscriptions in Roman-era Gaul record women serving as priestly attendants of particular deities, and one inscription even links a woman described as a Druid with a visionary dream. In Britain, an account of the Roman assault on Anglesey describes women in dark clothing moving among the defenders and urging resistance. A scene vivid enough to feel like eyewitness reporting. Yet the same sources do not clearly show women performing the central rituals of the Druid order while it was strong and organised. A likely explanation is that women were more visible as prophets, visionaries, and seer women, especially in later periods, when the older structures were weakening. In many religious traditions, when a formal male priesthood declines, forms of prophecy and folk divination persist longer and often become associated with women. Ireland offers even richer terminology. Stories speak of prophetesses and female seers, and the word Druid woman also appears. Legend claims that a Christian convent famous for maintaining a sacred flame was built over an older site where women had kept a fire in pagan times, a story that may preserve memory of continuity or may simply reflect the desire to give sacred places a deeper past. Irish myth goes further and names powerful female figures described as learned in magic, who bring darkness, storm, or terror on enemies. Other named women are remembered as enchantresses, foster mothers of heroes, or transformers who use water or other forces to change a person's life. Some of these are clearly mythical, but they reveal the cultural expectation that female specialists existed at least in the imaginative landscape. Late Roman biographies add dramatic tales of Druid women prophesying to emperors. One warns a ruler not to expect victory. Another tells a future emperor that he will rise after killing the boar, a riddle later explained through a political assassination of a man nicknamed Boar. A third has women foretelling the fate of dynasties. Modern scholars have questioned these stories, pointing out that the Latin word used for these women can mean a nymph rather than a priestess, that the geography sits near frontier zones, where Roman imagination about barbarian prophecy was especially active, and that earlier 1st century authors are largely silent about such figures. The most plausible reading is that these women, if they existed at all, were diviners rather than full ritual officiants, and that the Druid label reflects Roman habit of calling any Celtic prophetess by the most famous sacred title they knew. Reports of women living in island sanctuaries off the Atlantic coast of Gaul complicate the picture again. One account describes 9 virgins believed to control weather, advise sailors, and shift into animal forms. Another tells of an island where men were forbidden, where women served a god compared to Bacchus, and where a yearly ritual rebuilding of the temple roof ended in violent punishment if a worker dropped her burden. Some scholars think these tales echo Greek epic motifs, especially stories of enchanted islands and powerful women. Others argue that, while literary influence is possible, the details do not align neatly enough to dismiss them as pure borrowing. They may preserve a distorted memory of local cults that outsiders found strange and therefore described with the language of marvels. Among the best-known figures in Irish Druid tradition stands Mog Ruith, a character surrounded by stories that blend travel, politics, and spectacular displays of magic. In later legend, he is described as a master of forbidden knowledge, a man whose reputation reached beyond Ireland. The tales claim that, after absorbing what the tradition called the wells of learning in Ireland and Scotland, he set out with his daughter, Tlachtga, toward the Mediterranean world. The journey leads to Italy and to a famous antagonist from early Christian storytelling, Simon Magus. In these accounts, Mog Ruith and Tlachtga become partners in Simon's dramatic contest with the Christian apostles, not as passive observers, but as skilled collaborators. The central image in the Mog Ruith cycle is a strange flying device, remembered under names that describe it as a wheel, able to move through the sky. It functions as a symbol of daring and deception at once, a machine-like marvel meant to prove that Simon's power surpasses that of his rivals. The story reaches its climax in Rome, under the gaze of imperial authority. The wheel is said to rise, display its force, and then collapse in a public disaster. Simon is badly injured when the attempt ends in failure. Tlachtga is then cast as the one who gathers the broken remnants and brings them back across the sea to Ireland, turning the wreckage into a new set of dangers on Irish soil. The fragments are described as 2 massive stones, carried home and set in different places. The legends surrounding them are deliberately extreme, as if the physical remains of an enchanted object cannot be neutral. Looking at the stones brings blindness, touching them brings death. This kind of detail signals how the tradition thinks about magic. It is not merely an act performed and then finished, but a force that leaves residue behind. Even shattered, it continues to harm. Some interpreters treat the wheel as a disguised solar symbol, a turning power linked to the sky and the passage of light. The myth has even been compared to classical stories about reckless flight, because it turns ambition into catastrophe, and because it frames the air itself as a stage for punishment. Mog Ruith is not only a builder of marvels in these stories, he is also an active rival in the political and spiritual battles of Ireland. One tale has him driving a king and the king's Druids out of Munster through spells and fires, as if authority can be pushed back by a stronger ritual force. Another story describes an aerial duel with a competing Druid, a combat imagined above the earth rather than on it, where victory depends on mastery of the unseen. The same figure is credited with a more practical act as well, restoring water to a people in crisis. when sources are said to have been sealed by hostile magic. Mog Ruith finds a spring by shooting an arrow into the sky and marking where it falls. The method is symbolic and simple, yet the result is life-saving. In return, he receives land, and later tradition goes even further, claiming that families in the region carried his bloodline into historical times. Whether that last claim is believable or not, it shows what such legends are often doing. They bind mythic power to real landscapes and real names, making the past feel close enough to touch. Later writers who tried to assemble lists of famous Druids often included figures like Mog Ruith, among many others. Healers who discovered remedies against poisoned arrows, court Druids attached to named kings, men remembered for instigating wars, and rulers who supposedly carried Druid learning even after they left the throne. Some entries read like compressed saga summaries. Others sound like place name explanations, where a frightening local spirit becomes the Druid of a nearby mountain. The point of these catalogues is not accuracy in the modern sense. They reveal how widespread the memory of Druids became in Irish tradition, how easily the title could be attached to healers, prophets, advisors, and dangerous wonder-workers. One name stands out by its absence from the older record, Merlin. Later, medieval literature makes him the classic, Druid-like enchanter, but earlier documents do not clearly support that identity. His Druid label is largely a product of later storytelling, not something firmly anchored in the earliest evidence. This detail matters because it shows how the image of the Druid could expand over time, pulling new legendary figures into its orbit as generations reimagined the past. Behind the stories of individuals lies a larger question. What kind of religion did the Druids actually serve? If the Druids acted as the ministers of sacrifice in Gaul, then they cannot be separated from the gods their communities honoured. Caesar, when describing Gaulish belief, uses Roman god names such as Mercury, Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, and Minerva, but the description is best understood as translation rather than literal identity. The gods behind those labels were local Celtic deities, interpreted through a Roman lens. In the same stretch of his account, the Druids appear as the specialists connected to ritual practice, which leaves a strong implication that they were deeply entangled with the wider pantheon. Caesar also reports a tradition that the Gauls claimed descent from a god associated with the underworld. He says this belief was handed down by the Druids, which presents them not merely as ritual performers, but as keepers of origin stories. The detail about counting time by nights rather than days fits the same pattern. It frames the cosmos in a way that gives darkness a kind of priority. Similar ideas appear in Irish mythic structures, where forces linked with darkness are sometimes placed earlier in the imagined order of the world than the gods of daylight and life. Later, scholars have tried to connect the underworld figure described by Caesar with Irish divine names associated with death, though such identifications remain interpretive rather than certain. The long education described for Druid students points in the same direction. If the training truly lasted as long as ancient authors claim, then the memorized material was not a short handbook of spells. It must have contained a large body of sacred narrative, ritual formulae, and moral teaching, something closer to an oral library than a set of tricks. Comparisons have been made to other cultures that preserved vast sacred corpora by recitation alone, guarding them from casual use by keeping them out of writing. If Irish myth, even filtered through Christian scribes, preserves only a portion of what once circulated, then the scale of Druid learning becomes easier to imagine. Classical authors also suggest that Druid teaching included a strong belief in the endurance of the soul. Greek and Roman writers repeatedly attribute to Druids the claim that the spirit does not simply vanish at death, and that death is not a final border, but a transition. Poets turn this into dramatic language, presenting the idea as a challenge to fear itself. The dead do not remain in a silent underworld forever, but enter another phase of existence. Divine power associated with magical skill and control of natural forces, especially weather. Welsh tradition offers parallel figures who seem to inherit the same role, passing along a toolkit of illusion and transformation from one divine personality to another. Yet these identifications come from sources written long after Druidism had faded in Gaul, so caution is necessary. They may preserve older memories, but they may also reflect a later habit of reducing Druidism to magic, and then assigning it a single patron. Even so, an older and broader theme appears again and again: the sacred oak. Across Europe, the oak carried religious weight long before any neat theological system could be written down. One approach argues that early Druid belief began with reverence for the oak, not only as a symbol, but as a giver of life. Long before agriculture dominated diets, forests mattered. Oak wood built shelters and boats, fueled fires, and fed animals. Most importantly, the oak produced acorns, and archaeological finds show that acorns were stored and eaten even in communities that also cultivated grain. Classical writers confirm that acorn bread was real food in multiple regions, and that in times of scarcity people returned to it. Poetry preserves the memory in a different form, calling the oak man-feeding, as if the tree itself once acted as a mother of humankind. From there, the step into worship is not hard to understand. In many early societies, trees were treated as living beings filled with spirit. Some communities imagined certain trees as dwellings of the dead or as seats of divine presence. Whole groves could become untouchable because the supernatural was believed to inhabit them. In that framework, a powerful oak could become more than a resource. It could become the visible body or house of a god. Over time, the spirit of a tree could be imagined less as a hidden force and more as a personal deity with human shape, while still keeping the same powers, the ability to bring rain, protect herds, and strengthen crops. This is not a uniquely Celtic process. It is a pattern seen in many parts of the world, where animistic ideas gradually harden into structured polytheism. European religion offers vivid examples of oak cults outside the Celtic sphere. In Greece, Zeus was honoured at Dodona in a sanctuary where an oak stood at the centre of worship, and divine will was sought through the sounds and signs connected to the tree. Other Greek festivals describe rituals, where an oak is selected, cut, and shaped into an image, then dressed and treated as a bride in a story of divine reconciliation. Beneath the later myth, the ritual suggests a seasonal drama of sacred marriage tied to nature and renewal. These parallels do not prove that Druids copied Greek practice, but they do show how natural it was for Indo-European religions to locate divine power in the oak and to build ritual around it. In Gaul, a horned god is sometimes shown holding a bag spilling acorns or mast, feeding animals that gather at his side. This image ties divinity directly to forest fertility and to the oak's fruit. Some researchers have wondered whether such a figure absorbed older oak symbolism and became, in certain regions, a later face of the same deep idea, a god of the wild, of abundance and of the powers that live in the forest. Other named deities have been connected to Druid worship as well. A thunder god associated with fire sacrifice, a war god with royal overtones, and a bright fire festival god whose name echoes in seasonal rites. These links are debated, but the overall shape remains plausible. Druids, as ritual specialists, would have served the principal gods of their communities, rather than operating apart from them. Ancient authors add one more crucial detail about ritual practice. In Gaul, sacrifice was not treated as something anyone could do on a whim. At least one learned mediator was expected to be present, a figure described as a philosopher of the divine, someone believed to understand the gods well enough to make offerings intelligible. Some interpret this as a division of labour between a sacrificer and a theological specialist. Caesar's wording, however, presents Druids themselves as the people who handled sacrifice and ritual questions, which again supports the idea that they combined roles rather than separating them neatly. In a society where law, education, prophecy, and worship overlapped, the Druid becomes a single figure standing at the crossing point. Across much of ancient Europe, the oak was not just a tree. It was treated as a living emblem of the sky's most dramatic forces. The heavy rains that fed the fields, the thunder that shook the ground, and the lightning that split the night. In Greek tradition, Zeus could be imagined not only as a ruler seated above the clouds, but as an oak god whose authority showed itself through storm and fire. Some modern interpreters argued that this association may have grown out of a simple, practical observation. If people could produce fire on earth by rubbing certain kinds of wood together, then it was easy to picture the fire of the heavens being generated in a similar way. Lightning became the sky's version of the same phenomenon, and the storm god's power over rain followed naturally from his power over thunder. The same pattern appears again and again in different regions. In Italy, Jupiter was tied to the oak and to the violent weather that seemed to gather around it. On Rome's Capitoline Hill, he was honoured as a god of storm, rain, and thunder, and the oak carried his presence in visible form. Some scholars have suggested that the famous sacred grove at Nemi, long remembered for its fierce ritual traditions, may also have revolved around an oak at its centre, reflecting a similar devotion to a tree that represented divine strength and fertility. Far to the north, Germanic peoples revered the oak as the tree of their thunder god, the one later remembered by names that mean the Lord of Thunder. The god's character was fertilizing as well as destructive. The storm that breaks the air also fills the soil. Among Slavic communities, the oak belonged to the thunder god Perun, whose imagery often includes the idea of a thunderstone, a hard fragment of the sky's fire imagined as a weapon in the divine hand. In places like Novgorod, tradition speaks of sacred fires that were not allowed to die, with priests held responsible in a way that suggests the flame was more than a practical light. It was the continuous sign of an unbroken covenant with the god. Oxen, animals associated with strength and productive power, were offered as sacrifices, a detail that appears in several oak-centered cults and repeatedly links storms with fertility, blood with growth, and ritual violence with the promise of harvest. In the Baltic world, the thunder god Perkunas was likewise bound to oak groves, and when Christian missionaries cut them down, the response was not simply anger at the loss of trees. It was grief, as if a living sanctuary had been murdered. Reports from the late medieval and early modern periods describe perpetual fires maintained in these regions. And even when the reliability of individual witnesses is debated, the larger pattern is hard to dismiss. The details align closely with what is known from many other tree cults. A sacred grove, a fixed ritual centre, a guarded flame, and a priestly role that resembles a high office. One medieval writer even describes a revered Prussian high priest, whose authority was compared, in status, to a pope, and whose duty included tending a perpetual fire at a central sanctuary. Whether every detail is exact or not, the outline fits a recognisable religious structure that survived in parts of Europe far longer than people often assume. This broad background matters for understanding the Druids because it places them inside a continent-wide habit of thought in which the oak was treated as the best possible home for a sky god. When scholars discuss the very word Druid, one long-standing suggestion links it to the oak itself, as if the title originally meant men of the oak. That interpretation gains weight when the oak's sacred status is traced across so many different peoples. It becomes difficult to argue that the Celts alone would have stood apart from a cult so widespread, especially when ancient reports repeatedly connect Druids with groves and with rituals performed under trees. At the same time, Celtic religion was never limited to one sacred plant. Different regions emphasized different trees, and local cults could be absorbed, adapted, or blended. Forests could be personified as goddesses tied to particular landscapes, and the divine could be imagined not just in a single trunk, but in a whole woodland. Even so, oak symbolism remains persistent, especially where early Christian sites appear to have been planted directly on older sacred ground. In Ireland, a striking example is Kildare, whose name is often interpreted as a reference to an oak sanctuary. The later Christian tradition there famously maintained a perpetual fire guarded by holy women, and the pattern is so close to the perpetual fires of certain Eastern European oak cults that it invites comparison. It is possible that an older sacred flame, once dedicated to a pre-Christian figure linked to poetry, healing, and craft, continued under a new religious name, with the outer story changed, while the older practice quietly survived. There is also a complication in Ireland's later sources. Another tree, the yew, sometimes appears as the primary sacred wood in specifically Irish Druid stories. In some accounts, Druids carry yew wands and kindle ritual fires from yew. Some writers took this to mean that Ireland's Druids were never tied to the oak at all. That conclusion does not sit comfortably beside the wider evidence. Oak-related place names are common. Cutting down an oak could be treated as a serious offence, and early Christian figures are said to have opposed the destruction of oak groves. A more balanced reading is that the oak held an older sacred status, and that later tradition, for reasons that remain unclear, sometimes shifted emphasis toward the yew without erasing the oak's earlier importance. Long after formal worship faded, the oak continued to carry a shadow of sanctity in popular belief. Across England and Wales, individual ancient oaks were remembered as haunted, forbidden, or judicial. Some served as meeting places for local courts in the Middle Ages, as if the tree still marked a centre of authority. Others were treated as dwellings of spirits and dangerous presences. The language changes over time. What may once have been called a god becomes an elf, a fairy, a demon, or a restless spirit. Yet the underlying idea stays similar. The oak is not an ordinary tree. It has an inhabitant. It hears. It punishes. Folk rhymes warn that old oaks are full of unseen beings, and traditions describe protective tricks, like turning a coat inside out, as if the everyday person needed a simple defence against the oak's invisible residents. Certain details are especially revealing. In some areas of England, very old hollow oaks were nicknamed bull oaks, with people explaining the name by saying that bulls once sheltered inside them. Even if that explanation is just rustic imagination, the association between oak and bull is striking, because the bull appears again and again as a sacrificial animal in thunder god worship across Europe. The oak also drew lightning in popular belief, and old rhymes warn against standing beneath it in storms. That fear may preserve an ancient logic. The oak was not merely at risk from lightning. It was thought to attract it because it belonged to the thunder spirit. Stories of oaks that groan or shriek when falling fit the same atmosphere. The tree is imagined as alive in a deeper sense, capable of lament, as though something inside it is being driven out. If the oak was the great emblem of the sky god, the plant most tightly tied to Druid tradition is the mistletoe. The strongest ancient description of a Druid mistletoe ritual portrays it as the most sacred growth on the most sacred tree, as if anything that appeared on the oak had come from the heavens. The plant's rarity on oak trees made it even more special, a sign that the divine had chosen a particular branch. In the described ceremony, the timing followed the cycle of the moon. The gathering was treated as a solemn act, and the cutting tool was imagined as precious. A sickle of gold or possibly bronze in some readings. The plant was caught in cloth rather than allowed to touch the ground, reinforcing the idea that it carried a power that could be spoiled by ordinary contact. The ceremony also included 2 white bulls, animals emphasized as untouched by previous ritual use. And after the mistletoe was taken, the bulls were sacrificed and prayers were offered for the plant to bring blessing. The plant itself was credited with potent effects, restoring fertility to animals and countering poisons. This description can sound like a medical recipe at first glance, but the structure suggests something larger. It looks like a fertility rite staged under the authority of a sacred tree, involving a powerful animal sacrifice and a plant believed to contain concentrated life. Similar combinations appear in other ancient traditions, where a ruler or priest cuts the first sheaf at a seasonal festival and sacrifices a white ox tied to fertility. The repetition of the same elements across cultures, white cattle, a sacred cutting act, and a vegetation-linked festival, suggests that the logic behind such rites reaches back into very old layers of religious practice. Later, critics argued that the mistletoe ritual, as recorded, might be incomplete or misunderstood. The plant may have mattered for reasons beyond folk medicine. Some suggested that the rite could preserve the outline of an older, harsher practice, with animals replacing human victims, or that the plant was once treated as something that had to be seized before the tree could be taken in a larger sacrificial drama. Even without those speculations, the core meaning remains clear. Mistletoe was not treated as a simple herb. It was treated as a sacred substance extracted from a divine body. Folk belief across Europe supports that basic picture. In rural practice, mistletoe was fed to cattle to protect the dairy or to influence fertility, especially around the turn of the year. It was used as a medicine for humans as well, praised as a cure for fits, weakness, wounds, and a long list of complaints, which fits the old claim that it was an all-healing plant. In some regions, it was also linked directly to strength and courage, even to athletic performance, as if it carried a concentrated vitality that could be transferred to the body. Elsewhere, it appears as protection against lightning. In Scandinavian tradition, it could be called the broom of the thunder god, and when hung in houses, it served as a shield against stormfire. All of this keeps the plant tied to the same 2 ideas that dominate the older ritual: fertility and thunder. A particularly vivid set of stories surrounds families and sacred trees, where mistletoe becomes a kind of living omen. In Scotland, one noble house was said to flourish only as long as a certain mistletoe survived on a particular oak, and the decline of the plant predicted ruin. The charm practices attached to such beliefs are equally specific. A sprig cut at a precise time, with a new blade after circling the tree in the sun's direction, becomes a protective talisman against witchcraft and against death in battle. This is the old logic of sacred plants in miniature. The power is real, but it must be taken correctly, at the right moment with the right gestures, or it turns against the human hand. Mistletoe's later role as a Christmas decoration and a lover's plant is often treated as a light, playful custom, yet it sits on top of older patterns that were not playful at all. In parts of northern England, a kissing bush existed before mistletoe became common there, built from evergreens and bright fruit, then later supplemented by mistletoe, once transport made it easy to obtain. That change suggests that mistletoe was remembered as important even where it was once rare. In York, an old practice involved bringing mistletoe into a major church at Christmas and proclaiming a kind of seasonal liberty. Whether every detail of those reports is reliable or not, the theme echoes an older festival logic seen in the ancient world. A winter season of suspended punishment, loosened rules, and symbolic renewal. It suggests that the plant's public display may once have been more than decoration. It may have signalled a special time when ordinary order was temporarily transformed. There is also a darker side to the plant's reputation. Stories claim that those who cut mistletoe improperly, or without sanction, suffered injuries and bad luck, as if the plant defended itself. That idea reinforces the sense that mistletoe was treated as property of the sacred tree and of the power behind it. Even when belief softened into superstition, the warning remained. Take it wrongly, and it harms the taker. Some interpretations go further and argue that mistletoe was not simply the soul of the tree, but its concentrated life force, the part that carried generative power. That reading tries to explain why the plant is linked so strongly with fertility in animals, why it attracts love customs, and why bulls, symbols of vigour, appear in the central ritual. In that view, the sacrifice becomes an exchange. A powerful animal life offered in response to the removal of a powerful plant, believed to hold the tree's vital energy. This kind of reasoning can be difficult to prove directly for Druids themselves, because the sources rarely explain motives plainly. Yet it matches how many ancient fertility rites work. An extraction of sacred substance, a compensating offering, and a promise that the cycle of growth will continue. Whether the Druids crafted and honoured physical images of their gods has long been argued back and forth, largely because the ancient evidence points in more than one direction. Some writers describe Celtic worship as if it centred on living symbols rather than statues. One account, for example, says the Celts honoured a sky god through a great oak, treating the tree itself as the visible form of divine power. Yet other sources make it hard to claim that the Celtic world avoided images altogether. Shrines in major southern ports were said to contain statues of goddesses, and Celtic groups in central Anatolia were reported to have recognisable images of their deities. Roman observers, moving through Gaul, remarked on the widespread presence of god figures, especially those linked to the Roman Mercury, and one poet even described a famous grove as filled with images. The question, then, becomes less about whether images existed, and more about what those images looked like and how old the custom really was. Some evidence suggests that many early sacred figures were not refined sculptures in the later classical sense, but rough, direct forms, tree trunks hacked into human-like shapes, heavy pillars, or standing stones with minimal carving. Archaeology supports that possibility. In parts of northern France and coastal Brittany, figures linked to Mercury have been found carved on or near standing stones, as if older stone monuments were reused or reinterpreted, rather than replaced. This style fits a world where the sacred could be shown without needing the clean anatomy and precise faces of Greco-Roman statuary. One influential argument claims that Druid tradition resisted human-shaped idols and that full-bodied statues only became common once Roman influence spread through Gaul. That idea is tempting because the Roman period clearly pushed Celtic gods toward recognizable human forms, sometimes blending local deities with Roman names and artistic styles. Yet the problem with the anti-image argument is simple. Ancient writers do not plainly describe the Druids as hostile to images, and if such a strong taboo had existed, Roman observers would likely have noticed and commented on it. It is also clear that animal images and animal symbols were honoured in Gaul, and that worshippers could treat a carved form as sacred even if it was not a lifelike statue. Some historians offered a middle path that fits the mixed evidence better. Instead of imagining a strict ban on idols, they pictured a gradual shift. Older sacred objects may often have been unshaped or only partly shaped. Pillars, trunks, stones, while later generations, especially under Roman cultural pressure, became more comfortable presenting gods with faces, bodies, and identifiable attributes. In that model, the Druids could still be part of the religious system without needing to be the inventors of every statue. The sacred landscape already had its standing stones and wooden posts, and new forms could grow around them. Irish tradition adds another layer, because it speaks constantly about idols. Yet, it doesn't always connect those idols directly to Druids. Ancient glossaries and stories describe people keeping idols close at night to influence dreams, and certain named rites are said to involve invocations directed toward sacred objects. The most famous Irish idol is often described not as a carved person at all, but as a major standing stone treated as a power in its own right. At the same time, some writers point out something striking. Even when Irish sources are confident that the population practiced idolatry, they sometimes fail to specify a priestly idol service class attached to those objects. In other words, the idol is certain, the ritual is implied, but the administrative details are blurry. There are, however, moments where the line between Druid activity and idol imagery seems closer. Some accounts place images and altars together at specific locations, almost as if a recognized cult site existed with its own setup of sacred objects. Other stories frame political centers as seats of both pagan worship and Druid practice, though the word idolatry in later Christian writing can sometimes function as a general label for pre-Christian religion, rather than a precise description of statues and sacrifices. A dramatic Irish tale illustrates how later tradition liked to stage the conflict between old religion and new faith. In this story, an Irish king who has embraced Christianity is confronted by Druids, bringing a golden calf-like image into his presence. The chief Druid challenges him to return to ancestral practice. The king refuses, mocking the idol as nothing more than a decorated animal form, even when it is brought back covered in jewels and fine trappings. The story ends with the king punished through enchantment and death. Later readers have noticed similarities to the famous biblical episode of the golden calf. And it is possible that Christian storytellers reshaped older material into a familiar moral structure. Yet even if the story was edited, it still preserves a key point about how tradition imagined Druids, as people who could wield ritual objects, stage public religious challenges, and use supernatural revenge when social authority slipped from their hands. Beyond literature, physical finds from Ireland complicate the picture further. Numerous small figures have been recovered from bogs, some wooden, some metal, often with stylized clothing, heavy beards, or unusual proportions. A few were reportedly gilt or decorated, suggesting they were not casual toys. One large metal figure found in the soil was heavy enough to sound like an object of display. A bigger wooden image discovered in a bog was described as having pins or pegs driven into it, with traces of ornaments nearby, as if offerings had once been attached. Another report describes a temple-like site, later reused by Christians, where a figure like Apollo was said to be bound to a tree and marked by arrows. That last image is especially suggestive because shooting victims with arrows appears in some accounts of ancient sacrifice, and in many parts of the world, striking a sacred tree or sacred trunk with weapons is a recognized ritual act. Even if such descriptions are exaggerated, they keep returning to the same theme: sacred power focused into wood, stone, and the violence of symbolic attack. Some Irish examples blur the boundary between idol and folk remedy. One wooden female figure, kept carefully within a family, was supposedly brought to the bedside of smallpox victims. A sheep would be sacrificed, its skin wrapped around the sick person, and the household would consume the meat. That pattern combines healing, sacrifice, and a sacred object into a single ritual system. And it shows how an idol could function as a working tool in everyday crisis, rather than as a distant temple statue. Other tales speak of kings struck down by lightning for honouring idols, presenting nature itself as the enforcer of taboo. One major antiquarian theory argued that carved figures may have replaced earlier standing stone worship. In that view, Ireland moved from the reverence of raw stones to the reverence of shaped posts and small effigies, perhaps influenced by outside religious currents that brought new styles of sacred representation. Whether that path happened everywhere is uncertain, but it would explain why so many Irish sacred objects look halfway between a pillar and a person, closer to a symbolic marker than to a classical statue. So, were these figures part of Druid worship? A cautious answer is the most honest one. Some of the objects may reflect other cults, local traditions, or later folk practices. Yet, it is difficult to imagine a religious landscape filled with sacred figures and altars, while Druids, who are repeatedly described as central religious authorities, were entirely uninvolved. The more reasonable picture is that image worship existed in multiple forms, from standing stones to rough-hewn trunks to later Roman-style statues, and that Druids operated within that world even if they did not control every idol or invent every carving. Irish tradition also preserves a curious claim that Druids believed they could create the world. A story survives in which a king gathers Druids, hears them boast of having made heaven and earth, and then challenges them to prove it by changing the paths of the sun and moon. They fail, and the king ridicules them. On the surface, this sounds like a simple tale designed to humiliate pagan priests, but the boast itself may echo something older. In many societies, priesthoods and kingship rituals include ceremonies described as creating the earth or making the world, not as literal cosmology, but as a way of renewing fertility and restoring order when crops fail. Some traditions use a clay model of the world, place plants into it, and imitate the sun with fire, believing that reenacting creation grants control over life and abundance. Other cultures renew creation daily through royal ritual, or retell creation through mythic dismemberment, where the universe is formed from the body of a slain being, and the rite is repeated through sacrifice to recharge the land's vigour. Seen in that broader light, the Irish claim about Druids creating the world could preserve the memory of a ritual language once tied to kingship and seasonal renewal. By the time later stories were told, the rite could have lost credibility or been misunderstood, leaving only a bold claim and a king's mocking test. Another area where Druids appear briefly is the worship of wells. Early Christian notes about St. Patrick describe him arriving at a spring that local religious specialists honoured with offerings, treating the water source as divine. This is one of the rare explicit links between Druids and spring worship, and even there the description is filtered through a Christian lens. Still, it matters because sacred wells across the Celtic world often sit near old trees in local legend, and rituals around wells can become complex. Offerings, pins dropped into water, spoken curses, and inherited roles for people who act like caretakers or priestly attendants. Later, Folklore even records individuals living near a well, keeping a book of names, assisting those who sought blessings or harm, and presiding over a kind of unofficial shrine economy. The details differ from place to place, but the pattern suggests that springs were not just natural features, they were social and religious centres, with rules, specialists, and fear attached. Welsh storytelling preserves a mythic scene that ties many of these elements together in one dramatic sequence. A knight rides to a tall tree beside a spring, finds a special bowl, pours water onto a slab, and instantly thunder roars while a violent storm erupts. Birds burst into song from the branches, and then a mounted champion appears to defend the place. If the challenger wins, he marries the defender's wife and becomes ruler, but only if he continues to guard the spring. The story reads like a polished medieval tale, yet its structure feels older than romance. A thunder tree, a rain-making well, an ordeal combat beneath the sacred tree, the transfer of rule through victory, and the marriage to a woman who looks less like a private person and more like a figure embodying the land's sovereignty. The resemblance to other European sacred king patterns is hard to miss, and it suggests that older ritual ideas could survive as narrative even after the rites themselves changed. Outside sacrifice, clear information about Druid ritual is scarce, but Irish tradition describes acts that resemble religious officiation in the full sense. Some stories speak of a form of pagan baptism, where Druids perform naming rites over newborns using ritual words and water. Other passages show Druids at burials, giving funeral speeches, placing arms with the dead, chanting formal verses, and overseeing ceremonies that combine mourning with public display. In the background sits the sense that Druids were not merely advisors or magicians, but officials who marked the big thresholds of life: birth, naming, death, and the transfer of social roles. All of this leads into the question of Druid philosophy, a term that can easily mislead. Roman writers sometimes spoke of Druids as thinkers because they encountered something unexpected among people they called barbarians. Disciplined, priestly authority, rules enforced through spiritual penalties, and a doctrine of the soul that sounded, to Roman ears, like serious metaphysics. Some Romans were fascinated by the idea that the soul did not end with death, and by the confidence with which Druids claimed to speak about the unseen. At the same time, Roman reaction also included disgust, especially where sacrifice seemed brutal. The image that emerges is not of a clean school of abstract reasoning, but of a priesthood where myth, taboo, ritual law, and a certain moral code were fused into a system that shaped behaviour. Later, Christian writers sometimes made extravagant claims that Druids taught a pure unity of God or prepared Britain for Christianity. Such statements are difficult to treat as straightforward history, yet it remains plausible that early Druid religion may have been dominated at first by a single powerful cult symbol, such as the oak god of thunder and rain, before absorbing a wider crowd of deities from the larger Celtic pantheon. Over time, the system could have become a kind of national religious framework in some regions, not unlike how older thunder god cults in other cultures made room for additional gods while still holding a central prestige. If any moral teaching can be safely extracted from scattered reports, it is simple and tough, rather than philosophical in a later academic sense. Honour the gods, avoid wrongdoing, and practice courage. That kind of summary fits a society where taboo and law are closely linked, where lawful and not lawful define morality as much as compassion or universal ethics do, and where kings themselves are bound by strict prohibitions that shape the fate of the community. This is also why classical writers could praise Druids as just and sincere. A disciplined caste, living on plain food, avoiding luxury, and acting as judges would naturally produce that impression, even if its inner world view still relied on magic, omen reading, and the management of fear.